At first light, the Great Sphinx does not seem to rise from the desert so much as remain after everything else is withdrawn. The sky brightens over Giza, the limestone changes from grey to pale gold, and the immense face looks east across a landscape that has been altered by kings, quarrymen, priests, excavators, tourists, groundwater, wind, and more than 4,000 years of repair. Its body stretches low against the plateau, part monument and part exposed geology, a lion shaped from the same bedrock beneath its paws. Yet the most persistent question is not what stands above the sand, it is what may lie below it. For generations, people have imagined chambers beneath the chest, tunnels beneath the flanks, sealed passages behind the tail, forgotten archives under the paws, and whole systems of rooms descending into the limestone darkness. Some of these stories begin with visible openings, others begin with instruments registering irregularities underground. Many begin with something less measurable, the powerful feeling that a monument this old, this damaged, and this silent must be hiding more than archaeologists have admitted. That feeling is easy to understand when standing before the Sphinx enclosure. The monument appears to occupy a hollow cut into the plateau, surrounded by walls of exposed limestone. From certain angles, the Sphinx seems almost trapped inside the stone from which it was carved. The head rises above the enclosure, but the body sits lower, close to the level where drifting sand repeatedly gathered. For long periods of history, much of the lion's form disappeared beneath the desert. At times, only the head and upper back remained visible. The buried body became a landscape beneath a landscape, hidden not by a carefully built roof, but by ordinary wind carrying countless grains of sand. Every burial made the monument seem more ancient. Every excavation made it appear newly discovered. Every reopening encouraged the suspicion that something else might still be waiting below. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story beneath the Sphinx is not a simple choice between a secret chamber and an empty bed of stone. It is a slower and stranger investigation involving ancient excavation, natural fractures, later tunneling, incomplete records, changing technologies, and the human tendency to turn uncertainty into architecture. The real evidence is often less spectacular than the legend, but it is also more revealing. A narrow passage dug by treasure seekers may tell more about the history of the monument than an imaginary library. A natural fissure can become important because someone widened it, entered it, blocked it, and left later generations to wonder why. A seismic anomaly can become famous even when researchers cannot tell whether it represents a void, a weakened layer, a crack filled with sand, or a deliberately cut space. The Great Sphinx belongs to the monumental landscape of Giza, a place where genuine underground structures are everywhere. Tomb shafts descend into rock. Burial chambers lie beneath mastabas. Quarries cut deep into the plateau. Passages penetrate pyramids, trenches, foundations, drainage features, and ancient working areas survive beneath later deposits. The idea of hidden space is therefore not absurd in itself. Ancient Egyptian builders routinely worked both above and below ground. The difficulty lies in moving from that broad truth to a specific claim about the Sphinx. A cavity is not automatically a chamber. A chamber is not automatically ancient. An ancient chamber is not automatically a library. And a blocked opening does not prove that someone in modern times is trying to conceal what lies beyond it. The monument's condition makes the mystery harder to read. The Sphinx is not a single untouched sculpture preserved exactly as its makers left it. Its surface carries layers of loss and intervention. Parts of the softer limestone body have eroded deeply. Other areas are covered by repair blocks placed during different periods, sometimes over much older repairs. The paws, chest, flanks, and rear have all required attention. Stone has cracked, flaked, dissolved, and absorbed salts. Restoration has protected the monument, but it has also changed what later visitors can see. An opening visible in an old photograph may appear sealed in a newer one because it was stabilized. A cavity may be hidden behind masonry added for conservation. To someone already convinced that secret chambers exist, any blocked hole can look like suppression. To a conservator, the same feature may simply be a dangerous fracture that allows water, sand, or people to enter weakened rock. This is where the language of secrecy begins to grow. Archaeological sites are rarely open in the way popular imagination expects. Access is limited because monuments are fragile, because excavation can destroy the very relationships researchers need to study, and because entering unstable cavities can be dangerous. Permits are controlled. Investigations take years to publish. Some surveys produce ambiguous results that do not justify excavation. These normal restrictions can appear suspicious when viewed from outside, especially at Giza, where every delay is easily interpreted as concealment. The silence of the stone is then joined by the silence of institutions, and together they create the perfect setting for stories about discoveries that officials supposedly refuse to reveal. Yet there is another side to the record. The Sphinx has been measured, photographed, mapped, repaired, excavated around, and examined by generations of specialists. Detailed modern mapping has recorded the contours of the monument, the surrounding enclosure, visible fissures, restoration phases, adjacent temples, geological layers, and the shape of the quarry-like hollow from which the lion emerges. This work does not answer every question, but it makes one fact difficult to ignore. The Sphinx is not an unstudied object guarded by a complete wall of secrecy. Much of the strongest evidence is publicly known, although it is scattered through technical plans, excavation reports, conservation records, old photographs, and geophysical studies that rarely produce the dramatic certainty demanded by headlines. The contrast between the careful record and the popular legend is part of what makes the subject so compelling. The legend promises a single revelation: open the correct door, descend the hidden staircase, and the truth will be waiting intact. Archaeology offers something more complicated. It reveals a monument changed by natural forces and human actions, surrounded by real subterranean features, but not yet connected to any confirmed underground complex. It records small passages that exist, cavities that may exist, and anomalies that require interpretation. It also exposes how easily the absence of a final answer becomes evidence for whatever a person already believes. Even the word beneath can mislead. Beneath the Sphinx may mean directly under the chest. It may mean below the enclosure floor. It may refer to fissures inside the bedrock, shafts near the monument, groundwater moving through porous limestone, or features detected at some distance from the body. Different reports use different methods and investigate different zones, yet popular retellings often combine them into one enormous hidden system. A void near one side becomes a chamber under the paws. A passage in the rear becomes an entrance to an archive. An anomaly elsewhere on the plateau becomes proof of a city. Once combined, these separate clues seem to reinforce one another, even when they were never shown to be connected. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness deserves neither dismissal nor exaggeration. There are openings in and around the monument that have been documented. There are fractures shaped by geology and sometimes modified by people. There have been surveys reporting irregular subsurface zones. There are also strong reasons to doubt the most elaborate claims. No accepted archaeological publication has demonstrated a hall of records, a buried city, or a vast network of chambers beneath the Great Sphinx. What survives instead is a more subtle mystery, a colossal sculpture cut from living rock, repeatedly swallowed by sand, repeatedly uncovered, and repeatedly interpreted through the hopes of each new age. For the ancient Egyptians, the buried spaces around royal monuments belong to a world of ritual, death, kingship, and controlled passage. For later treasure hunters, they promised gold. For mystics, they promised lost wisdom. For modern researchers, they hold geological and archaeological evidence that must be approached carefully because excavation cannot be undone. The Sphinx remains at the center of all these expectations, its face exposed to the sunrise while its lower body rests in the weathered limestone hollow. To understand what may truly lie below, the first task is not to search for a secret door. It is to understand how the Guardian itself came out of the bedrock, and how the landscape around it was transformed into one of the most carefully planned monumental settings of the ancient world. The Sphinx did not arrive at Giza as a statue placed upon the ground. It was released from the plateau itself. To create it, ancient workers cut downward into a broad mass of limestone, removing the surrounding rock until a central block remained. That surviving core became the lion's body, chest, paws, and human head. The enclosure around it is therefore not merely a setting built afterward. It is the negative space left by the act of carving. Every wall of the hollow record stone that was taken away, and every curve of the monument record stone that was deliberately left behind. This simple fact is crucial, because it means that any investigation beneath or beside the Sphinx begins with the landscape already transformed by quarrying. What appears to be a mysterious depression is also a construction scar on an enormous scale. The limestone of Giza is not uniform. It lies in natural beds, some stronger and more resistant, others softer and more easily eroded. The head of the Sphinx occupies a harder layer, which helps explain why its basic form has survived better than much of the body. Lower down, the lion is carved from weaker stone that has suffered deep weathering and repeated loss. Ancient builders did not work with a perfect block of homogeneous material. They shaped a monument through a geological sequence, adapting to layers that behave differently under tools and weather. The broad proportions of the Sphinx are inseparable from that geology. The body is long and low because it follows the available bedrock. The head rises where the stronger stone allowed it. The enclosure walls expose the same bands, making the monument and its surrounding hollow parts of one geological structure. This method created both opportunities and limitations. Carving directly from living rock gave the Sphinx extraordinary permanence and connected it physically to the plateau. It could not be removed, carried away, or easily dismantled. At the same time, any major flaw in the bedrock became a flaw in the monument. Natural joints and fissures were not merely surface cracks. Some continued through the stone. Softer layers could retreat beneath harder ones. Water could move along fractures. Wind-blown sand could abrade exposed surfaces. The ancient sculptors could cut away poor material or patch damaged areas. But they could not replace the geology beneath the lion. What survives in the record suggests that repairs began far earlier than many visitors assume, perhaps because sections of the body were vulnerable almost from the beginning. The stone removed from the enclosure did not necessarily go to waste. Large blocks quarried from around the Sphinx were used in nearby temple construction, linking the statue physically to the monuments in front of it. The Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple stand close by, built from massive limestone blocks faced in places with harder stone. Researchers have long studied the relationship between the quarry beds, the cut blocks, and the temple walls, because matching geological layers can reveal how the entire complex was planned. The striking possibility is that the builders were not first carving a statue and then deciding what to do with the discarded rock. Monument, quarry, enclosure, and temples may have been conceived as an integrated operation, with the removal of stone serving more than one purpose. The Sphinx Temple lies directly east of the monument, aligned with the rising sun and enclosed by heavy masonry. Its architecture is austere but carefully arranged, with open courts, pillars, and sanctuaries that appear to reflect the solar and royal symbolism of the site. Nearby, the Valley Temple forms part of the causeway system, associated with the pyramid complex of Khafra. The traditional archaeological interpretation places the creation of the Great Sphinx within this 4th dynasty landscape, most likely during Khafra's reign in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. The precise identity represented by the face is still debated, and no surviving inscription from the monument's construction announces who ordered it or why. Yet the spatial relationship among the Sphinx, temples, causeway, and Khafra complex provides the strongest context for its accepted dating. This absence of a construction inscription has always troubled people who expect a monument of such scale to explain itself. Egyptian kings often covered later buildings with names, titles, and ritual scenes. But the exposed body of the Sphinx preserves no clear contemporary text identifying its maker. The silence created room for later traditions. Some attributed the monument to different kings. Others believed it predated the pyramids. Modern writers have treated the missing inscription as evidence of a lost civilization. But ancient construction records are uneven, and the lack of a dedicatory statement does not erase the archaeological setting. Dating depends not on one dramatic label, but on relationships among quarrying, architecture, geology, pottery, masonry, landscape planning, and later inscriptions that show how the monument was understood after its creation. The ancient workers who shaped the Sphinx probably used the same general technologies employed elsewhere at Giza copper tools: stone pounders, wooden levers, ropes, sledges, abrasives, and a large, organized labor force. Harder stone tools could batter and rough out limestone. Copper chisels and other implements could refine surfaces, although tools needed constant maintenance. The process would have advanced in stages. Quarrymen first isolated major masses of rock, cutting channels and removing blocks. Sculptors then established the monument's broad profile. Finer teams shaped anatomical details, while planners controlled alignment and proportions. The finished surface may have been smoother and more visually unified than the scarred monument seen today. Traces of pigment reported from parts of the Sphinx suggest that it was once coloured, turning the familiar pale guardian into a far more vivid royal image. The lesser-known surprise is that the monument may have appeared almost new and ancient at the same time. Its face and body were freshly cut, but the material itself already bore the deep history of a seabed laid down millions of years before humans existed. Fossils and sedimentary textures within the limestone belong to a vanished marine environment. The royal builders were carving political and sacred meaning into stone formed under ancient waters, although they could not have understood that geological origin as modern science does. The Sphinx therefore stands at the meeting point of several timescales: the age of the rock, the age of the pharaohs, the centuries of burial and restoration, and the modern era of excavation. Carving down into the plateau also meant that drainage mattered from the beginning. The enclosure forms a basin where water can collect or move along the bedrock. Rainfall at Giza is limited, but sudden storms can produce runoff, and moisture can travel through cracks and porous layers. In later centuries, rising groundwater and nearby urban development added new concerns. Ancient builders may have cut channels or shaped surfaces to guide water away, but the evidence is incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every feature around the enclosure. Some grooves and cuts may be practical, others may belong to quarrying, still others may be the result of erosion or later work. The close connection between sculpture and quarry complicates every later claim of tunnels. A cut in the enclosure wall might be an extraction trench rather than an entrance. A recess may mark the removal of a block. A narrow channel could be related to drainage, construction, or restoration. Natural fissures might have been widened for inspection or treasure hunting, because the Sphinx was carved from a worked landscape. Human and geological features overlap. The plateau does not offer a clean distinction between untouched nature and deliberate architecture. It offers a palimpsest in stone. By the time the original construction was complete, the Guardian stood within a monumental system rather than in isolation. Behind it rose the pyramid of Khafre. In front lay temples connected to ritual movement from the Nile Valley toward the royal tomb. Causeways crossed the plateau. Priests, workers, officials, and visitors moved through spaces designed to control sight, access, and ceremony. The Sphinx faced east, toward the place where the sun returned each morning, while its lion body projected strength, vigilance, and royal power. It may have served as a guardian, a solar image, a representation of kingship, or some combination of these meanings. Scholars still debate the exact theology intended by its creators, partly because later Egyptians reinterpreted the monument through their own religious language. What matters for the underground mystery is that the first great transformation beneath the Sphinx was not the construction of a hidden city. It was the carving of the enclosure itself. Thousands of tons of stone were removed, redistributed, and built into neighbouring structures. Natural layers were exposed. Cracks became visible. The body was left attached to the plateau, carrying every weakness of the rock beneath it. The landscape around the Guardian was shaped into a complex of open courts, massive walls, ceremonial routes, and royal monuments. Before any later tunnel was cut, before sand buried the paws, and before modern instruments searched for voids, the builders had already created a place where quarry, temple, statue, and geology could never be separated. That integrated landscape should have made the Sphinx easy to identify. A royal pyramid rises behind it, temples stand before it. Causeways and quarries connect the monument to one of the most intensively studied building programs of the ancient world. Yet the nearer researchers come to the moment of creation, the quieter the written record becomes. No surviving inscription carved during construction names the king who ordered the Sphinx. No foundation text explains its purpose. No contemporary papyrus describes the quarrying of its body, the shaping of its face, or the ceremonies intended for the space between its paws. The monument dominates the plateau, but its original voice has been lost. This silence is not the same as complete ignorance. Archaeology rarely depends on a single document, and monuments do not need signed labels to be understood. The Sphinx sits beside architectural features commonly associated with the pyramid complex of Khafre, the 4th dynasty ruler whose pyramid stands immediately to the west. The alignment of the Sphinx temple, the Valley Temple, the causeway, and the quarry cuts has led most Egyptologists to place the monument within Khafre's reign, around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. The blocks removed from the enclosure appear connected to the construction of nearby temples. The sequence of building activity fits the broader development of Giza. Taken together, these relationships form a strong archaeological case. Strong, however, does not mean perfectly documented. The face of the Sphinx has often been compared with surviving statues of Khafre, but facial comparison in ancient royal art is more difficult than it first appears. Egyptian sculptors did not simply reproduce a ruler's features as a modern portrait artist might. Royal faces combined individual traits with idealized forms meant to express youth, control, divinity, and enduring authority. Damage further complicates the comparison. The Sphinx has lost its nose and ritual beard, while centuries of weathering have softened details around the eyes, mouth, and cheeks, depending on which surviving statue is chosen and which proportions are emphasized. The resemblance can appear persuasive or uncertain. Some researchers have proposed other kings, particularly Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid. Arguments for Khufu often focus on stylistic interpretation, the face, or broader planning of the plateau. Others suggest that the Sphinx may have been begun under one ruler and completed or incorporated into the complex of another. These possibilities are debated, but none has displaced the mainstream association with Khafre. What survives in the record suggests a 4th dynasty origin within the royal construction landscape, while the precise commission, sequence, and intended likeness remain less secure. Later Egyptians themselves inherited uncertainty. More than 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved, the monument was already ancient. Sand had gathered around its body, and its original name may no longer have been remembered. During the New Kingdom, it became associated with the solar god Horemakhet, meaning Horus in the horizon. Kings restored it, built chapels nearby, and treated it as a sacred being whose importance survived even when its earliest history did not. This later reverence preserved the monument, but it also overlaid its original identity with new meanings. The most famous later inscription stands between the Sphinx's paws. The dream stealer, erected by Thutmose IV in the 15th century BCE, tells how the young prince rested near the buried monument and received a promise of kingship if he cleared away the sand. The story is powerful because it shows the Sphinx speaking through a later religious tradition. Yet the stealer does not identify the original builder with certainty. Its damaged text contains royal references that have been interpreted in different ways, but it was erected roughly a millennium after the 4th dynasty. It reveals how New Kingdom Egyptians understood and restored the Sphinx, not necessarily what its creators called it. A surprising detail lies within the story's setting. The prince does not encounter a pristine royal monument standing fully exposed in an active Old Kingdom complex. He encounters an ancient guardian already overwhelmed by the landscape. The body is buried, the sacred space requires clearance, and the original builders belong to a remote past. Even for Thutmose IV, the Sphinx is an archaeological mystery. The cycle that later fascinates modern explorers had begun long before classical historians, medieval travellers, or European excavators arrived. Egyptians themselves were uncovering, interpreting, and restoring the monument while its first purpose was fading from memory. The missing records have encouraged an assumption that evidence must once have existed and was deliberately removed. In some cases, royal monuments were usurped, names were erased, and political enemies were excluded from official history. Ancient Egypt certainly practiced selective memory, yet there is no clear evidence that the Sphinx's construction inscription was systematically destroyed to conceal its origin. It may never have carried an extensive contemporary text. Any inscriptions placed on nearby structures may have been lost through quarrying, collapse, weathering, or later rebuilding. The absence remains important, but it does not automatically imply suppression. Giza's surviving written record is uneven in other ways as well. The builders left marks inside inaccessible parts of the Great Pyramid, including names of work crews connected to Khufu. Administrative papyri from the Red Sea site of Wadi al-Jarf later revealed details of transporting limestone during Khufu's reign. Tomb inscriptions around Giza preserve titles held by officials and workers. These discoveries show that documentation existed, but they also demonstrate how accidental survival can be. A record may remain because it was sealed inside a chamber, discarded in a remote harbour, or protected in a tomb. Another may vanish because it stood exposed near the surface. The Sphinx's original name is one of the most telling losses. The modern word sphinx comes through Greek tradition and was applied to Egyptian composite creatures long after the monument's creation. The Greek sphinx, often female and winged, belongs to a different mythological world. The Great Sphinx is male, wingless, and royal, combining the body of a lion with the head of a king. Later Egyptian names survive, but the term used by the monument's builders is unknown. That gap subtly changes the entire mystery. Modern observers approach the statue through a foreign name attached centuries later, while its first identity remains beyond recovery. Its purpose is similarly reconstructed rather than stated. The lion was a potent image of physical power and royal protection. The human head transformed that force into controlled kingship. Facing east, the monument watched the horizon where the sun appeared, and later Egyptians explicitly understood it through solar symbolism. Its placement beside the royal funerary complex suggests that it guarded or sanctified the approach, but whether it represented Khafra himself, a divine form of kingship, a solar guardian, or several meanings at once cannot be reduced to one surviving sentence. Ancient monuments often carried layered meanings that seemed obvious to their intended audience and therefore required little explanation. This uncertainty creates fertile ground for claims that the Sphinx belongs to a civilization earlier than dynastic Egypt. The argument usually begins with the missing inscription and then treats the absence as evidence against the Fourth Dynasty setting. Yet a missing document cannot by itself establish an alternative builder. Any older dating must account for the archaeology of the enclosure, temples, quarry blocks, construction sequence, artistic tradition, and the broader landscape. No accepted body of evidence currently demonstrates that an unknown prehistoric culture carved the monument thousands of years before Khafre. Scholars still debate details of chronology and attribution, but the debate takes place within a substantial Old Kingdom context. The missing records nevertheless matter because they shape how every physical clue is received. When a tunnel appears, there is no construction plan explaining whether it was intentional. When a cavity is detected, there is no ancient inventory describing its contents. When a blocked opening is found, no surviving text states when or why it was sealed. Each feature must be dated through tool marks, sediment, masonry, repair phases, and its relationship to the surrounding stone. In that environment, even a small uncertainty can expand into a large story. The Sphinx therefore stands in an unusual position. Its archaeological setting is strong, but its original biography is incomplete. Its likely dynasty is known, but its exact commission is not. Its later sacred importance is well documented, but its first name is lost. Its face may represent Khafre, yet no surviving inscription confirms the identification in direct language. The monument is not unknowable, but neither is it fully explained. That distinction is essential. Mystery does not begin where evidence ends. It begins where evidence becomes uneven. The silence around the Sphinx is real, but it is not empty. Architecture, geology, quarrying, restoration, and later inscriptions speak in place of the missing construction text. They do not deliver the simple certainty of a signed foundation stone. Instead, they preserve a more fragmented story, one that must be assembled from relationships in the landscape. And because those fragments survive through centuries of burial, the sand itself soon became one of the most powerful forces shaping what people could see. Remember and imagine about the Guardian of Giza. Sand does not need intention to conceal a monument. It needs only time, wind, and a hollow where drifting grains can settle. The Sphinx enclosure provides exactly that kind of trap. Cut below the surrounding plateau, open to the desert air, and interrupted by walls, paws, temples, and exposed bedrock. It repeatedly gathered the landscape around it. The process was gradual enough to seem almost invisible from day to day, yet powerful enough to erase most of the lion's body from sight. Long after the original rituals of the Old Kingdom had faded, the head could remain above the surface while the chest, flanks, paws, and enclosure disappeared beneath a rising floor of sand. This burial transformed the monument physically and symbolically. A fully exposed lion is a guardian. A head emerging from the desert is something stranger, a survivor, an oracle, or the visible fragment of a much larger form hidden below. Later visitors did not always know how far the body extended or what structures lay around it. The sand concealed the relationship between sculpture, quarry, temple, and causeway. It simplified the monument into a face above the earth, while everything beneath became available to imagination. The more the desert hid, the more later generations assumed it might be preserving. The Dream Stealer of Thutmose IV records one of the earliest famous clearances. By the New Kingdom, roughly 1,000 years after the likely construction of the Sphinx, sand had already covered much of the body. The royal story presents the monument as a sacred power waiting to be released. The prince rests near the exposed head, receives a divine promise, and later removes the sand. Whatever political purpose the inscription served, it reveals a practical reality even ancient Egyptians had to excavate the Sphinx. The builders belonged to the distant past. The enclosure required recovery, and restoration had become part of the monument's continuing life. The clearance did not last. Sand returned after royal attention moved elsewhere. Periodic restorations and excavations exposed portions of the body, repaired damaged stone, and reopened access, but no intervention could permanently stop the desert. The monument entered a rhythm of appearance and disappearance. Its visible condition depended not only on erosion, but on whether a government, ruler, religious institution, or excavation team was willing to keep removing what the wind brought back. Greek and Roman visitors encountered the Sphinx in different states of exposure. Some left inscriptions in the surrounding area, evidence that the monument remained a destination and object of wonder. Roman period work may have cleared and repaired parts of the site, creating paths and viewing areas around the ancient guardian. Yet the collapse of organized maintenance allowed burial to resume. By the medieval period, descriptions often focused on the enormous head rising from the sands. The body existed, but it belonged to rumour, memory, and partial observation. This repeated burial helps explain why early accounts seem inconsistent. One traveller describes visible shoulders, another sees only the neck and head. A later drawing includes a portion of the back that an earlier observer had not recorded. The monument did not change shape so quickly, but the sand around it did. Artistic convention added further distortion. Before careful surveying, illustrators frequently imagined the hidden body or adjusted proportions according to what they thought an Egyptian sphinx should look like. Some showed a rounded chest, others a more upright creature, and many underestimated the extraordinary length of the lion's body. Treasure hunters saw opportunity in the uncertainty. A buried monument might contain chambers, and a sealed chamber might contain gold. Digging near the Sphinx was therefore not always motivated by scholarship or conservation. People searched for passages, widened cracks, and entered openings without leaving reliable records. A hole made during one century could be mistaken in another for an ancient doorway. Loose sand might preserve the evidence of disturbance poorly, while later repair could obscure the entrance altogether. This is one reason why the history of the documented tunnels cannot be separated from the history of burial. Sand concealed original surfaces, but it also concealed the actions of later intruders. Early modern excavators faced an enormous physical task. Clearing the monument meant moving vast quantities of sand by hand, basket, shovel, and organized labor. Removing material from one part of the enclosure often created unstable slopes nearby. Wind could begin undoing the work almost immediately. Excavation was not a single dramatic uncovering, but a repeated struggle to keep the site open long enough to observe it. Some investigators concentrated on the front paws and the space between them. Others dug around the chest, flanks, or rear. Each campaign exposed a different portion of the monument and produced new claims about what had been found. The work of Giovanni Battista Caviglia in the early 19th century marked an important phase in this process. His excavations cleared areas around the front of the Sphinx and revealed architectural and sculptural fragments, including pieces associated with the monument's ceremonial beard. These discoveries showed that the buried zone contained real archaeological material. The sand was not empty. It held fallen fragments, later inscriptions, repair evidence, and traces of changing use. Yet the existence of buried artifacts also encouraged more ambitious expectations. If fragments lay beneath the surface, perhaps entrances did as well. Auguste Mariette and other 19th century investigators continued working in the wider Giza landscape, while the Sphinx remained only partly cleared for long periods. Large-scale modern exposure came through successive 20th century campaigns, particularly those associated with Emile Barrès, who spent years removing sand and stabilizing the monument. By the time the body and enclosure were more completely visible, the Sphinx looked radically different from the isolated head familiar in earlier images. Its long back, damaged flanks, extended paws, layered repairs, and surrounding cut rock walls could finally be studied as a connected whole. That clearer view did not end the mystery. In some ways, it multiplied it. Once the sand was gone, researchers could see cracks, recesses, blocked cuts, restoration masonry, and irregular surfaces that had been invisible for centuries. Old photographs showed openings before they were repaired. New surveys documented features with greater precision. The monument became less imaginary but more complicated. The sand had hidden the evidence indiscriminately. Excavation revealed both ancient structures and later damage without always making the difference obvious. Burial also preserved some areas from direct wind erosion, while exposing others to different kinds of deterioration. Sand packed against the body could act as a physical shield, but it could also retain moisture and salts. When excavators removed it, surfaces that had been protected entered a new environment of temperature change, air pollution, evaporation, and tourist pressure. The act of revealing the monument created new conservation problems. A cleared sphinx was easier to study and admire, but not necessarily safer. The most surprising consequence of repeated burial is that the monument known today is partly a product of modern excavation. Its present visibility feels natural because photographs have fixed the exposed lion in public memory. Yet for much of recorded history, the full body was not the dominant image. The Sphinx existed as a head above the desert, a sacred fragment whose buried form had to be imagined. Modern visitors inherit the results of continuous sand removal, drainage, restoration, and site management. Without those efforts, the enclosure would begin to fill again. This history also weakens the simplest version of the concealment story. There was no single moment when authorities covered the Sphinx to hide what lay below. Nature repeatedly buried it, and people repeatedly dug it out. Different excavators opened, entered, repaired, and sometimes blocked features for different reasons. Records were incomplete, methods changed, and conservation decisions were not always clearly explained to the public. The result can look like a pattern of deliberate secrecy, even when it is largely the accumulated disorder of centuries. Still, burial leaves a lasting psychological effect. Anything uncovered from sand appears discovered, even when ancient people knew it well. Anything still covered appears potentially untouched, even when treasure hunters may have disturbed it long ago. The desert creates an illusion of sealed time. It suggests that beneath the next layer lies a clean answer waiting in darkness. What the sand actually preserved was more complex fragments of royal restoration, evidence of later devotion, scars from intrusive digging, collapsed stone, natural fissures, and the changing outline of the monument itself. As the enclosure finally emerged into modern view, investigators began identifying openings that were no longer hypothetical. Some were shallow, some followed cracks. At least one extended into the rear of the Sphinx far enough to deserve the name passage. None revealed the lost archive imagined by legend, but they established something important. The Guardian was not entirely solid, and the first real paths into its body were about to replace centuries of speculation with a more difficult kind of evidence. Once the sand was removed from the body, the Sphinx ceased to be an imagined solid mass. Its surface revealed interruptions. There were cracks wide enough to admit a hand, cuts that seemed too regular to be entirely natural, holes made during earlier investigations, seams hidden beneath repair masonry, and openings whose histories were uncertain. Some entered only a short distance. Others followed fractures deeper into the limestone. A few had been blocked, reopened, photographed, mapped, and sealed again. None formed the grand entrance promised by legend, but together they created the physical basis from which larger stories grew. The most important distinction is also the easiest to lose. An opening is not necessarily an original passage. The Sphinx has endured more than 4,000 years of quarrying nearby, restoration, probing, treasure hunting, weathering, and structural repair. A hole may have been cut by ancient workers, enlarged by later intruders, or produced by modern investigators searching for weaknesses. A natural fissure may look artificial after its sides have been trimmed. A deliberately cut shaft may lead nowhere because it was never intended as an entrance. Without a secure record of excavation, even a visible feature can resist simple classification. The limestone itself encourages confusion. Natural joints cross the monument and enclosure, created by geological stress long before the Sphinx was carved. Some fractures run vertically through multiple beds. Others follow the boundaries between harder and softer layers. Once exposed, they widen through weathering, salt growth, and the movement of moisture. Sand and debris enter them. Animals, insects, and plant roots may disturb their upper portions. Later people sometimes clear them out, making a natural opening resemble a tunnel. What begins as geology can gradually acquire a human shape. One of the best-known features lies toward the rear of the monument, where an opening enters the rump and follows a major fissure in the rock. This is the passage that later becomes central to the search for chambers beneath the Sphinx. Its existence is not disputed. It has been entered, measured, and documented. Yet its age and purpose are far less dramatic than its location suggests. The passage appears to follow a natural weakness, and much of its form was probably created or enlarged by people searching for hidden spaces after the Sphinx had already existed for centuries. It is real, but reality does not make it a ceremonial corridor. Other visible holes have appeared in the upper surface of the monument, including areas near the back and head. Historic photographs, drawings, and restoration records show that investigators sometimes drilled or descended into openings while testing the interior stone. These features are frequently presented online as ventilation shafts, sealed entrances, or access points to underground rooms. The surviving evidence is more cautious. Some are narrow vertical cuts associated with probing or older excavation. Others terminate within the rock or connect with fractures rather than constructed chambers. Their small scale is important. They show that people repeatedly tested the monument for hollows, but they do not reveal a planned network. The front of the Sphinx has attracted even stronger speculation. The enormous paws frame the dream stealer and create a natural focus for anyone imagining a hidden doorway. The chest rises behind them like a wall, while the floor between the paws has been cleared, rebuilt, and restored at different times. Stories of a chamber beneath the paws often treat this space as though it were an obvious architectural entrance waiting to be opened. Yet no confirmed doorway to a hall of records has been found there. Cuts, repairs, and subsurface irregularities exist in the area, but the visible arrangement is dominated by the monument's carved anatomy, later masonry, and the stela installed more than 1,000 years after the original construction. Between the paws and around the enclosure floor, the bedrock also contains depressions and irregular zones that may reflect quarrying or erosion. Ancient workers did not leave a perfectly smooth platform. They cut around natural beds, removed usable blocks, and adjusted surfaces as construction advanced. Later restorers added stone where the original limestone failed. When such features are partly hidden beneath repair blocks, their outlines can appear suggestive. A straight edge may look like the top of a sealed door. A rectangular patch may resemble masonry covering an entrance. Sometimes it is exactly what conservation requires: new stone fitted over damaged rock. Blocked openings are especially powerful because they seem to imply intention. If a passage is sealed, someone must have wanted it closed. But the reason can be ordinary. A cavity may threaten the stability of the body. An accessible hole may invite unauthorized entry. Open fractures allow wind-blown sand and water to penetrate. Animals can nest inside them. Conservation teams may fill or cover such spaces to prevent further damage. In an archaeological monument, sealing does not always preserve a secret. Often it preserves the stone. There are also cavities near the Sphinx rather than inside it. The enclosure walls, adjacent temples, and surrounding plateau contain natural fractures, quarry recesses, trenches, shafts, and later, archaeological cuts. Because popular accounts often use the phrase beneath the Sphinx loosely, a feature detected beside the monument can migrate beneath its chest in retelling. A void near one flank becomes a room directly under the body. A fracture between the paws becomes a corridor connecting to the pyramid. Several unrelated anomalies become a single system. Geography is compressed until every underground feature at Giza seems connected. The detailed mapping carried out around the monument was designed partly to stop this confusion. Surveyors recorded profiles, elevations, repair phases, geological beds, and visible fissures instead of treating every hole as an isolated mystery. The resulting picture is less dramatic but far more useful. The Sphinx contains and intersects a number of natural weaknesses. Some were modified by human activity. Several openings have been examined. No mapped feature has demonstrated a vast complex beneath the body. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is not absent. One lesser-known detail is how much of the Sphinx's apparent surface is not original carved bedrock. Large areas of the body are covered by masonry added during successive restorations. These blocks create a protective skin over damaged limestone. Behind them may lie deeply eroded surfaces, voids caused by stone loss or older repair layers. From the outside, a gap beneath masonry can appear to be an entrance into the monument. Structurally, however, it may be no more than the space between a weathered core and a later-facing block. The difference between a cavity and a chamber therefore becomes essential. A cavity is any empty or low-density space. It may be natural, accidental, or created by erosion. A chamber implies deliberate construction, recognizable boundaries, and a purpose. Instruments can sometimes indicate that a cavity exists, but they cannot always determine its shape or origin. Even direct entry may not settle the matter if later digging has altered the original form. What survives in the record suggests a monument that is neither completely solid nor secretly hollow in the way popular mythology imagines. It is a carved limestone body crossed by fractures, patched with masonry, punctured by historical investigations, and connected to a worked bedrock landscape. The known openings are important because they show how the search developed. People did not invent every hole. They encountered real features and then interpreted them through treasure stories, religious hopes, and expectations of lost knowledge. The temptation is to treat each opening as a fragment of one missing plan, yet they may belong to entirely different moments: geological formation, Old Kingdom quarrying, ancient restoration, later treasure hunting, 19th century probing, or modern conservation. Their proximity does not prove connection. Their concealment does not prove conspiracy. Their existence does, however, justify careful investigation. And among all these cuts, cracks, and blocked recesses, one passage stands apart because researchers were able to enter it far enough to observe its shape directly. It did not lead to an underground archive. It offered something less cinematic and more revealing: a narrow route through fractured limestone, marked by the ambitions of those who had searched before. The narrow route through the rear of the Sphinx offers no grand staircase, no polished walls, and no ceremonial doorway. It begins as an opening in the monument's rump, where the lion's body meets a major fracture in the limestone. From outside, its location seems almost too suggestive. A passage entering the back of the world's most famous guardian appears to promise access to something intentionally hidden within. Once entered, However, the feature becomes harder to romanticize. Its walls follow the irregular shape of weakened rock. Its course reflects a natural fissure more than a carefully planned corridor. Human hands have clearly altered it, but the passage does not resemble the finished architecture of an Old Kingdom burial chamber or temple route. This is the tunnel most closely associated with Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass, who inspected and mapped it during modern archaeological work. Lehner's involvement carries an unusual historical irony. Before becoming one of the leading specialists on the Giza Plateau, he'd been drawn to Egypt partly through stories surrounding Edgar Cayce and the supposed Hall of Records. The young seeker arrived expecting that the Sphinx might conceal evidence of Atlantis or a forgotten civilization. Years of excavation, mapping, geological study, and work among the monuments gradually replaced that expectation with a more disciplined question, not what people hoped the tunnel contained, but what the stone itself showed. Inside the rear passage, the evidence did not point toward a lost archive. The route appeared to have been opened or enlarged by treasure hunters after the monument was created. It followed a natural crack and ended without revealing a wider system. Its dimensions and rough surfaces lacked the deliberate planning visible in confirmed Egyptian underground architecture. There was no decorated chamber, no masonry-lined room, no branching complex, and no collection of texts. The tunnel was genuine, but its most likely history belonged to the long search for treasure rather than to the original design of the Sphinx. That conclusion can feel anticlimactic only if the value of evidence is measured by spectacle. In reality, the passage is one of the most revealing features in the entire story. It demonstrates how legends grow around physical traces. Someone encounters a fissure, clears it, widens it, and penetrates deeper into the monument. Later observers find the opening without a complete record of who made it. The tunnel then appears ancient because the monument is ancient. Its position inside the Sphinx gives it symbolic weight. Once blocked for protection, it gains another layer of suspicion. A treasure seeker's excavation can become, over time, the supposed entrance to a prehistoric library. The rear passage also reveals how difficult it is to date intrusive work. Treasure hunters rarely leave formal reports. Tool marks may be ambiguous. Later visitors disturb earlier debris. Restoration teams may alter the entrance to make it safe. Sand moves in and out. Without sealed deposits containing datable material, a passage can be assigned only a broad sequence. The natural fissure existed first. The Sphinx was carved around or across it, and people later modified the weakness while searching within the body. The evidence remains incomplete, but that sequence is far better supported than the idea of an original ceremonial corridor. Other entered openings around the Sphinx share this frustrating character. Some are vertical rather than horizontal. Investigators have descended into shafts or holes on the back of the monument, sometimes hoping to determine whether the lion's body contains larger hollows. These probes generally reveal limited cavities, fracture zones, or cuts that do not continue into substantial rooms. Several have been photographed in earlier phases of restoration, and later closed or covered. When those images reappear without context, they are often described as secret entrances sealed by authorities. The photographs are real. The conclusions attached to them usually travel much farther than the explorers themselves did. An opening near the top of the Sphinx has also attracted attention, because it seems to penetrate toward the head or upper body. Historical accounts suggest that people tested this area in search of internal chambers, perhaps lowering themselves or equipment into the cut. Yet the visible feature does not provide evidence that the head is hollow or connected to a descending tunnel system. Like many of the monument's openings, it appears limited and associated with probing, natural weakness, or later disturbance. The Sphinx's enormous scale encourages observers to imagine large internal spaces, but the surviving investigations repeatedly encounter solid or fractured bedrock rather than planned rooms. Small cavities beneath repair masonry have occasionally been entered during conservation work. These spaces can appear surprisingly dark and deep in photographs, because the camera looks through a narrow gap into an eroded zone behind the stone facing. Yet their origin is usually structural rather than ceremonial. The soft original limestone retreats, while the harder repair blocks remain outside it, creating pockets between the ancient core and the protective masonry. A person may be able to insert a camera, an arm, or even part of the body into such a gap, but that does not make it a chamber in the archaeological sense. The enclosure itself contains additional cuts and recesses that early explorers examined with varying levels of care. Some were probably connected to quarrying, others may have been formed by natural bedding planes or water movement. Treasure hunters working around the front and sides of the monument sometimes dug into suspicious surfaces, leaving scars that later investigators had to distinguish from ancient construction. In the absence of modern recording, an early excavation could destroy the very evidence needed to understand what had been found. This problem appears repeatedly in 19th century archaeology. Explorers often approached monuments with genuine curiosity but limited methods. The goal was frequently to reach objects, inscriptions, or chambers rather than preserve every layer of sediment. Workmen cut trenches quickly, removed debris, and followed openings wherever they seemed promising. Plans were sometimes approximate. Negative results were rarely described in the detail given to spectacular discoveries. If a tunnel ended after several meters, the excavation might be abandoned with little documentation. Later researchers then inherited the physical cut without a full account of how much was natural and how much had been enlarged. Modern mapping changes the standard of evidence. A passage is measured in relation to the whole monument. Its direction is compared with geological fractures. Its walls are examined for tool marks and bedding patterns. Photographs document the interior before repairs alter it. Surveyors record where the route begins, how far it continues, whether it changes elevation, and whether it intersects any other feature. This approach may seem slow, but it prevents several unrelated holes from being transformed into an imaginary network. The recorded passages show no such network. No entered tunnel has been demonstrated to connect the Sphinx with Khafra's pyramid, the nearby temples, the Great Pyramid, or a deeper city beneath the plateau. No explorer has emerged from the monument through a second entrance. No mapped route descends into a large chamber under the paws. Claims of extensive connections usually combine the rump passage with geophysical anomalies, nearby shafts, and much later stories, treating proximity as proof of continuity. One surprising lesson from these investigations is that entering a feature does not always resolve its mystery. Direct observation can show that a passage is rough, narrow, and fracture-controlled, but it may not reveal precisely who enlarged it or when. A small tunnel can be confidently rejected as a royal corridor while remaining difficult to date. Archaeology often narrows possibilities rather than producing a single perfect answer. The passages therefore occupy an uncomfortable middle ground. They are too real to dismiss as fantasy, but too limited to support the mythology built around them. They preserve evidence of natural geology, human intrusion, restoration, and repeated curiosity. Their darkness is genuine. Their histories are partly recoverable. Their destinations, so far, are modest. That modesty makes them important. The real tunnel at the rear of the Sphinx does not confirm the Hall of Records, but it explains how the Hall of Records could become believable. It provides a physical opening into which expectation can be poured. Once the passage is separated from the legend, what remains is a direct encounter with the monument's interior geology: layered limestone, natural fractures, weakened beds, and the marks of people who mistook geological possibility for architectural intention. To understand why so many openings form where they do, the investigation must descend beneath human stories into the much older structure of the plateau itself. Long before any sculptor cut the lion's back or shaped the human face, the stone beneath Giza was already divided by forces no ancient builder could see. The plateau is made of limestone deposited in a vanished marine environment, laid down in beds that differ in hardness, texture, fossil content, and resistance to weather. Some layers are dense and durable, others are softer, more porous, and more easily broken apart. Between them run bedding planes, joints, fissures, and zones where water can move. The Sphinx was carved into this uneven structure, and the monument has carried that geological inheritance ever since. The distinction between architecture and geology begins to blur almost immediately inside the enclosure. A straight line in limestone may be a bedding boundary rather than a cut made by tools. A vertical crack may continue through the monument because it formed under natural stress millions of years before the Fourth Dynasty. A recess can appear deliberate when softer rock erodes behind a harder layer. A hollow may widen where salts crystallize repeatedly within the paws. To an observer looking for chambers, these forms can resemble walls, ceilings, entrances, and corridors. To a geologist, they may represent ordinary behavior in layered limestone exposed to weather and moisture. The body of the Sphinx contains weaker stone than the head. This difference explains much of its present condition. The upper head is carved from a more resistant bed, while lower sections of the lion have suffered deep erosion and repeated repair. The chest, flanks, legs, and rear have all lost substantial material. In places, ancient or modern masonry covers the damaged core. The monument therefore does not weather as a single object. Each layer responds differently, and the visible surface becomes a map of the geology beneath it. Natural fissures are among the most important features in the underground mystery. Some run across the enclosure and continue through the body. When ancient workers carved around them, the fractures became exposed. Over centuries, wind, moisture, sand, temperature change, and salt growth enlarged them. Later people entered or widened some of these weaknesses. The rear passage appears to follow precisely such a fracture. Its existence is therefore not surprising once the geological structure is understood. The surprise would be if a monument cut from naturally jointed bedrock contained no cracks at all. Yet not every fracture is harmless. A narrow joint can conduct water into deeper layers. Moisture dissolves small amounts of limestone and carries salts through the stone. When the water evaporates near the surface, the salts crystallize and expand, pushing grains apart. Repeated cycles weaken the rock from within. A solid-looking block may become friable beneath its outer skin. Cavities can form behind repair masonry as the original limestone retreats. These processes are slow, but over thousands of years they produce spaces that may look like abandoned chambers when viewed through a small opening. Groundwater adds another layer of concern. The water table beneath the Giza area is influenced by geology, irrigation, nearby settlement, drainage, and modern urban development. Surveys using electrical resistivity, shallow seismic methods, and ground-penetrating radar have investigated the distribution of water beneath parts of the plateau. The results suggest that the average groundwater level is not presently rising directly into the Sphinx at the most alarming levels sometimes claimed. But nearby zones remain important because water can move through connected layers and fractures. The real threat beneath the monument may therefore be neither a sealed archive nor an empty city, but a changing relationship among limestone, moisture, salts, and human activity. This is less dramatic than an underground library, but it is more immediate. A chamber that has remained sealed for millennia can wait. Salt damage cannot. Conservation teams must understand where moisture enters, how quickly it moves, and which layers are most vulnerable. They must decide whether to seal cracks, improve drainage, replace damaged blocks, or leave certain zones open for monitoring. Every intervention risks changing the balance. A repair that blocks evaporation in one place may redirect moisture elsewhere. A stone facing that protects the surface may hide deterioration behind it. The geology also complicates geophysical surveys. Seismic instruments measure how waves travel through the ground. Dense, solid limestone transmits energy differently from fractured, weathered, water-filled, or empty zones. A slower wave may indicate a cavity, but it may also reflect weakened rock, a sediment-filled fissure, or a layer with different physical properties. Electrical methods detect contrasts in resistance, which can be influenced by moisture as well as voids. Radar signals respond to boundaries between materials, but uneven limestone, salts, rubble, and groundwater can create difficult reflections. Instruments do not see a room in the way a camera does. They record physical contrasts that researchers must interpret. This is why the word anomaly must be handled carefully. An anomaly is not a discovery in itself. It is a result that differs from the surrounding pattern. It may deserve further investigation, but it does not announce its own cause. A rectangular anomaly can appear compelling because human beings associate straight edges with construction. Yet survey resolution, processing choices, geological layering, and the angle of measurement can make irregular features look more regular than they are. Multiple methods and independent teams are needed before a subsurface signal can be described confidently. The Sphinx enclosure is especially challenging because it is already a disturbed environment. The bedrock has been quarried, temples were built nearby, sand accumulated and was removed repeatedly. Restoration masonry covers original surfaces. Earlier excavators cut trenches and probes. Modern utilities and drainage work may affect some surrounding areas. The ground is not a simple untouched block of limestone. Every survey must distinguish among natural geology, ancient construction, later disturbance, conservation work, and possible voids. One lesser-known detail is that natural dissolution can create small cavities without producing the spectacular caves imagined in popular accounts. Rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and soil, becoming slightly acidic. As it moves through limestone, it can dissolve the rock along joints and bedding planes. In a wetter climate or over immense spans of time, this process can enlarge fractures. At Giza, such features may remain narrow and irregular, but they are enough to generate local hollows and altered zones. If later people clear them, their natural origin becomes harder to recognize. The plateau's long geological history also lies behind the weathering debate that surrounds the age of the Sphinx. Some researchers have argued that the patterns on the enclosure walls indicate prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall, and therefore a much earlier construction date. Mainstream geologists and archaeologists generally explain the erosion through a combination of limestone quality, rainfall, runoff, salt activity, moisture, wind, and the monument's known history. The dispute remains famous because the surfaces are complex, but no single pattern can be read like a date carved into the wall. Weathering records processes, not names or dynasties. What survives in the stone suggests that the Sphinx was always vulnerable. Its makers carved across weak beds and natural fractures because the monument had to emerge from the limestone available in that location. They may have repaired damaged areas early. Later rulers added more masonry. Modern conservators continued the same struggle with better instruments, but no ability to replace the original bedrock. The Guardian appears eternal, yet its survival depends on continuous human attention. Understanding this geology does not eliminate the mystery beneath the Sphinx, it changes its scale. The monument may contain small voids, fissures, and modified natural openings. Some may not yet be fully mapped, others may be inaccessible without risking damage. But geology provides a powerful explanation for why irregular spaces exist and why instruments detect contrasts. It also warns against turning every underground signal into architecture. The stone beneath the Guardian is not empty. It is layered, fractured, porous, repaired, and slowly changing. Water moves through it. Salts grow within it. Weak beds retreat behind stronger ones. Ancient cuts intersect natural joints. Later tunnels follow paths created by the rock itself. The hidden world below the Sphinx may be less like a buried palace and more like a geological memory, preserving the interaction of sea-borne limestone, royal construction, desert weather, and thousands of years of human interference. That memory can be measured, but only imperfectly. As researchers began sending seismic waves, electrical currents, and radar pulses through the ground, the plateau answered with patterns rather than explanations. Some of those patterns appeared suspicious enough to revive the old dream of chambers. The next challenge was to decide whether the instruments had found architecture, natural weakness, or something in between. Before instruments could send waves through the limestone, excavators had already spent generations searching the ground around the Sphinx with the most direct method available, removing it. Sand, rubble, fallen masonry, later construction, and disturbed deposits were cleared from the enclosure, the temples, the causeways, and the neighbouring plateau. Each campaign changed the visible shape of Giza. Walls emerged where open desert had seemed empty. Floors appeared beneath drifting sand. Trenches exposed quarry faces. Shafts descended beside tombs. The landscape repeatedly proved that important structures could remain buried only a short distance below the surface. Yet the same excavations also established a limit that sensational stories often ignore. The ground around the Sphinx contains a dense archaeological world, but no excavation has revealed a vast secret complex directly beneath the monument. The Sphinx enclosure itself is the first buried structure in the story. It is easy to forget that the hollow surrounding the lion was once almost entirely filled. Clearing it exposed not just the body but the walls of the quarry from which the statue had been released. Those walls allowed researchers to study the sequence of limestone beds, tool marks, weathering, repairs, and the relationship between the monument and the adjacent temples. The more completely the enclosure emerged, the less it resembled the entrance court of an underground building. Its surfaces spoke instead of quarrying, sculpting, erosion, and repeated restoration. Directly in front of the Sphinx, excavation revealed the remains of the Sphinx Temple, a structure of extraordinary mass and unusual restraint. Its surviving walls and foundations are formed from enormous limestone blocks, some apparently cut from the very stone removed while shaping the enclosure. The temple contains open courts, pillar bases, recessed spaces, and carefully controlled alignments. It is incomplete in places, and scholars still debate whether it was fully used in the way its planners intended. Even so, it is unmistakably monumental architecture, and its existence matters for the mystery below. The ancient builders were entirely capable of creating complex sacred spaces at the site. When such architecture survives, it leaves recognizable plans, walls, thresholds, construction joints, and deposits. The supposed chambers beneath the Sphinx have not produced equivalent evidence. Nearby stands the Valley Temple associated with Khafra, another building assembled from massive limestone blocks and faced with harder granite. Its interior once contained polished floors, monumental pillars, and royal statues. Excavators found fragments of sculpture there, including images of Khafra that helped define the artistic world surrounding the Sphinx. The temple demonstrates how carefully formal spaces were constructed and how distinctly they differ from irregular fissures in bedrock. A royal chamber was not simply an empty hole. It was a planned environment with controlled access, finished surfaces, and ritual meaning expressed through architecture. The causeway connecting the valley area to Khafra's pyramid complex rises behind and beside the Sphinx. Its alignment has long shaped discussions about whether the Sphinx was planned as part of Khafra's building program or adapted from an earlier feature. Excavation and mapping show that the causeway, quarry cuts, enclosure, and temples form a tightly interlocked landscape. Some surfaces could not have been created in isolation from the others. This relationship does not answer every chronological question, but it places the monument within a visible system of Old Kingdom construction rather than above an unexplained subterranean world. The plateau surrounding the Sphinx is full of actual underground spaces. Tomb shafts descend vertically into the limestone. Burial chambers branch from their bases. Mastabas cover hidden rooms. Rock-cut tombs open in quarry faces. Nearby cemeteries contain passages, niches, offering chambers, and later intrusive burials. Workers and officials who served the pyramid complexes were buried in organized zones, while other parts of the plateau were reused for centuries. This abundance makes stories of hidden tunnels seem plausible, because Giza genuinely is riddled with cavities made by human hands. But these spaces have patterns. Tomb shafts tend to occur within defined burial plots. Chambers relate to superstructures above them. Entrances, blocking stones, pottery, human remains, tools, inscriptions, and construction debris provide context. Even a robbed tomb usually preserves enough of its arrangement to identify its function. No comparable archaeological pattern has been established beneath the body of the Sphinx. There is no confirmed line of tomb shafts entering from the enclosure floor, no mapped series of chambers aligned below the paws, and no excavated corridor connecting the lion to the pyramid behind it. Excavations east and south of the monument uncovered additional walls, pavements, drainage features, and occupation evidence linked to the long use of the site. Some belonged to pharaonic restoration. Others came from Greek, Roman, or later activity. These discoveries show how many different populations altered the ground around the Sphinx. A wall that appears ancient may be centuries younger than the monument. A cut may belong to restoration rather than original construction. A buried floor may represent a later viewing area. The archaeological layers do not preserve one frozen moment. They preserve repeated returns. One surprising feature of Giza is the scale of the infrastructure beyond the royal monuments. Excavations farther south and east revealed settlements, workshops, bakeries, storage areas, administrative buildings, and galleries associated with the people who supported pyramid construction and temple life. The plateau was not an empty sacred desert occupied only by kings and priests. It was connected to a living community of labourers, craft specialists, officials, food producers, and transport crews. Their buildings left walls, ash, animal bones, ceramics, seals, and everyday tools. This ordinary evidence has done more to explain how Giza functioned than any claim of a hidden archive. The workers' settlement also changed the meaning of underground discovery. Beneath the sand, researchers did not find a vanished super-civilization with unknown technology. They found the logistical remains of organized human effort bread production, livestock processing, storage, administration, and housing. The monumental landscape was sustained by a society whose traces were practical and abundant. The real revelation was not that the pyramids had been built by mysterious outsiders, but that their construction depended on planning, supply, labor specialization, and institutions capable of feeding and coordinating large groups. Closer to the Sphinx, excavators repeatedly tested suspicious areas. Trenches were opened beside walls. Debris was removed from recesses. Openings were followed until they ended or became unsafe. Foundations were examined where conservation allowed. The results were often useful but rarely dramatic. They clarified building sequences, exposed repairs, revealed fallen fragments, and documented how the enclosure had changed. Negative evidence mattered as well. When an area expected to contain an entrance instead showed solid bedrock or ordinary quarry fill, the search narrowed. Negative results rarely travel as far as rumours. A photograph of an excavation trench can be circulated as proof that authorities found something. The later backfilling of that trench can be described as concealment, yet archaeological trenches are routinely refilled to protect exposed surfaces. Open cuts collect water, destabilize walls, and invite unauthorized entry. Once recorded, they may be covered again because permanent exposure would cause more damage than knowledge. To the public, the earth appears to close over a secret. To the archaeologist, the site is being preserved. The detailed mapping of the Sphinx and its surroundings helped unite these separate excavations into one coherent picture. Plans showed the body, enclosure, temples, quarry faces, restoration zones, and structural geology in relation to one another. This work replaced isolated anecdotes with measured space. A reported hole could be located precisely. A supposed tunnel could be compared with known fissures. A wall could be assigned to a construction phase. The result did not eliminate every uncertainty, but it made the idea of an unmapped vast complex increasingly difficult to sustain without new evidence. No single excavation has explored every cubic metre beneath the monument, and responsible researchers do not claim that every possible cavity is known. The evidence remains incomplete because intrusive excavation under the Sphinx could threaten the structure itself. Small inaccessible spaces may survive. Undetected cuts may exist along fractures. Yet what has been exposed around the enclosure supports a monumental quarry and temple landscape, not a buried city. The deeper excavators looked into Giza, the more the plateau revealed itself as crowded rather than empty. It held temples, tombs, settlements, shafts, quarries, roads, workshops, and layers of restoration. These genuine discoveries should have reduced the need for imagined ones. Instead, they demonstrated that the desert could conceal almost anything, and that realization kept the larger legend alive. When direct digging reached its practical limits, researchers turned to methods that could look through the ground without opening it. The stone would no longer be removed. it would be made to answer through vibration, resistance, and reflected energy. The first waves sent through the ground around the Sphinx did not return with images of rooms. They returned as numbers, delays, contrasts, and patterns. Seismic instruments measure how quickly energy travels through stone. Electrical surveys measure how strongly the ground resists current. Radar records reflections from boundaries beneath the surface. Electromagnetic methods respond to differences in material properties. None of these techniques produces a simple window through the limestone. Each creates an indirect model, and every model depends on where instruments are placed, how signals are processed, what assumptions guide the interpretation, and how complicated the ground already is. Around the Sphinx, that ground is exceptionally complicated. The bedrock is layered and fractured. Some zones are dry, others retain moisture. Ancient quarrying has removed large masses of stone. Temples and restoration blocks create sharp material boundaries. Sand and rubble fill depressions. Earlier excavators left trenches and probes. Natural fissures may be empty in one place and packed with sediment in another. Under these conditions, an unusual signal is expected. The difficult task is deciding whether it represents something archaeologically meaningful. A widely discussed investigation used seismic refraction around the monument to study both weathering and possible subsurface cavities. Small vibrations were introduced into the ground, and sensors recorded the arrival of waves after they had passed through the limestone. Solid, compact rock generally transmitted those waves more rapidly than fractured or weathered zones. Empty spaces, loose fill, and weakened stone could slow, bend, or disrupt the signal. The survey reported irregularities in several areas, including zones near the sides of the Sphinx and between the front paws. Those results quickly entered popular accounts as evidence of hidden chambers. The phrase seismic cavity sounded far more definite than the underlying measurements justified. In reality, the survey detected areas whose physical behavior differed from the surrounding rock. Some could represent voids, others could be heavily fractured beds, weathered zones, sediment-filled cracks, differences between quarry cuts and untouched limestone, or pockets affected by moisture. Seismic data alone could not determine whether a feature had smooth walls, whether it was artificial, or whether anyone had ever entered it. One reported anomaly near the front of the monument drew particular attention because of its position between or close to the paws, the very place where later legend located a hidden archive. Geography gave the signal symbolic power. Had the same irregularity appeared beneath an ordinary quarry floor, it might have been discussed as a geological feature requiring further testing. Beneath the Sphinx, it became a candidate chamber before its shape or origin had been established. The expectation of a room influenced how the result was remembered. The investigators themselves did not uncover an entrance or excavate a constructed space. Their measurements suggested contrast underground, not a furnished chamber. This distinction is central to responsible interpretation. Instruments can identify where further work may be useful, but they rarely provide the final archaeological answer. A cavity must still be confirmed through additional methods: drilling, camera inspection, or excavation. At the Sphinx, each of those options carries structural and conservation risks. The monument cannot be treated like an empty field where a trench may be opened simply because a signal looks interesting. Seismic surveys also became entangled with arguments about the age of the Sphinx. Measurements of slower wave speeds in the surface layers were interpreted by some researchers as evidence of deep weathering, possibly suggesting that parts of the enclosure had been exposed for longer than the accepted 4th Dynasty chronology allowed. Critics pointed out that weathering depth is influenced by limestone variability, drainage, fracture patterns, burial history, moisture, and the geometry of the survey. Turning wave velocity into a precise construction date requires assumptions that the stone does not necessarily obey. Scholars still debate aspects of the erosion, but the seismic results have not overturned the broader archaeological context of the monument. An earlier electromagnetic investigation by a Japanese team had also reported possible subsurface irregularities around the Sphinx and nearby monuments. Later summaries described signals that might indicate cavities, passages, or zones affected by water near parts of the lion's rear. The work helped establish Giza as an early testing ground for non-destructive archaeological technology. Yet the equipment and processing methods of the 1980s had limitations, and the reported possibilities were never transformed into confirmed rooms through excavation or independent imaging. The language used in preliminary surveys often contributes to later confusion. Researchers may describe a possible cavity, probable discontinuity, or high-resistance zone. Such wording expresses uncertainty, but secondary retellings remove the qualifications. Possible becomes detected, detected becomes discovered. A subsurface discontinuity becomes a doorway. By the time the story reaches a headline, the instrument appears to have mapped a chamber in full detail, even though the original study may have shown only a blurred contrast across several meters. Ground-penetrating radar provides another useful example. Radar antennas transmit pulses into the ground and record the energy reflected from subsurface boundaries. In favorable conditions, the method can detect walls, trenches, floors, and voids. But limestone containing fractures, salts, moisture, rubble, and uneven surfaces can scatter the signals. Depth estimates depend on assumptions about the speed of radar waves through the material. Strong reflections may indicate architecture, but they can also come from natural bedding, repair masonry, wet zones, or abrupt changes in sediment. Electrical resistivity tomography measures how strongly different underground zones resist the passage of electrical current. Dry limestone and empty cavities may show high resistance. Moist sediments and groundwater usually show lower resistance. The method has been valuable for studying water beneath the Giza area, including the risks posed to monuments and nearby temples. Yet even here, interpretation requires caution. A high-resistance feature may be a dry void, a dense block, or simply less porous stone. A low-resistance zone may indicate water rather than a tunnel. The strongest geophysical discoveries are those confirmed by several independent approaches. When muon detectors identified a large void inside the Great Pyramid, multiple teams using different detector technologies recorded the feature from separate positions. Even then, researchers described it carefully as a void rather than immediately declaring it a tomb, corridor, or a royal chamber. Its precise function remained unknown. The finding demonstrated what convincing non-destructive evidence looks like: repeatable signals, independent confirmation, transparent methods, and conclusions narrower than the public imagination would prefer. No anomaly beneath the Sphinx has yet reached that standard. There are reported irregularities worthy of attention. There are plausible cavities in fractured limestone. There may be spaces too small, unstable, or inaccessible to investigate directly. But no independently confirmed dataset has mapped a vast room, connected tunnel network, or underground complex beneath the monument. No geophysical result has been followed by a documented entry into a purpose-built chamber. A lesser-known problem is that survey maps can appear more precise than the ground truth. Computer processing assigns shapes and colours to invisible contrasts. Sharp boundaries on the finished image may partly reflect the mathematical model rather than actual stone walls. Viewers naturally interpret a coloured rectangle as a rectangular object, even when the original measurements were sparse and the reconstruction uncertain. The cleaner the image becomes, the easier it is to forget that it represents probability rather than direct vision. This does not make geophysics unreliable, it makes it scientific. The methods are most powerful when used to test specific questions, guide limited excavation, compare repeated measurements, and rule out possibilities. They can reveal that the ground is not uniform. They can identify where water accumulates, where limestone is weakened, and where a potential void deserves further study. They cannot replace archaeology, geology, or physical confirmation. The Sphinx answered the surveys, but it answered ambiguously. The waves suggested fractured zones and possible cavities. Electrical and electromagnetic methods hinted at contrast beneath and beside the monument. None supplied the hidden library that many had already imagined. Yet because several signals appeared in places associated with the legend, uncertainty itself became fuel. The instruments had not discovered the Hall of Records, but they had given the old story a modern vocabulary, allowing prophecy to return disguised as data. The Hall of Records did not begin with an inscription found at Giza, it began with a prophecy. In the 20th century, the American mystic Edgar Cayce claimed that survivors of Atlantis had preserved their knowledge in a hidden archive beneath or near the Great Sphinx. According to the story that grew around his readings, the chamber contained records of a lost civilization, the history of humanity, advanced science, and truths deliberately forgotten by the modern world. The entrance was often placed between the paws, where the Sphinx's body, the dream stealer, and the enclosure floor already formed a visually compelling stage for secrecy. Nothing in the known Old Kingdom evidence described such a library. But the idea spread because it transformed an ancient monument into a locked container holding a complete answer. The timing helped. Archaeology had already shown that spectacular discoveries could emerge from sealed spaces. Tutankhamun's tomb had been opened within living memory. Hidden rooms, intact burials, and lost texts were not pure fantasy. They were genuine features of Egyptian archaeology. The problem was not the general possibility that something might remain undiscovered. The problem was the specific leap from that possibility to Atlantis, a preserved global archive, and a chamber located exactly where a modern prophecy placed it. The Hall of Records was not evidence. It was an expectation imposed on the site before the search began. Cayce's followers treated the Sphinx as more than a royal monument. It became a marker left by an earlier civilization whose wisdom had survived a catastrophe. The absence of an original construction inscription was reinterpreted as support. The monument's damaged face became evidence of extreme antiquity. Sand burial suggested intentional concealment. Natural fissures became entrances. Every gap in the archaeological record appeared to make room for the prophecy. The theory was difficult to disprove because the failure to find the chamber could always be explained by searching in the wrong place, using insufficient technology, or encountering official resistance. This pattern is common in modern mystery traditions. A claim begins with a definite conclusion and then recruits ambiguous evidence afterward. A tunnel is not evaluated by its construction, date, or geology. It is valued because it might lead toward the expected archive. A seismic irregularity is not simply a zone of altered wave velocity. It becomes the outline of the predicted room. When excavation fails to confirm the interpretation, the absence does not weaken the belief. It strengthens the suspicion that something has been hidden. Mark Lehner's early path into Egyptian archaeology shows how powerful this story could be. He arrived in Egypt influenced by the Casey tradition and the possibility that the Sphinx concealed the Hall of Records. Yet long exposure to the plateau changed the nature of his questions. Mapping the monument required attention to limestone beds, quarrying, repair blocks, tool marks, architecture, and excavation history. The closer the investigation came to the physical evidence, the less the Sphinx resembled a sealed Atlantean machine. It became instead an Egyptian monument embedded in the building landscape of Giza. That transformation is important because it was not produced by ridicule or dismissal. The myth was tested against the site. The rear passage was entered and mapped. The enclosure was measured. Geological fissures were recorded. Temples and quarry relationships were studied. The evidence did not reveal a prehistoric archive. It revealed the long physical biography of the Sphinx. The search for one dramatic secret opened the way to a far richer, if less sensational, understanding of how the monument had been carved, weathered, buried, restored, and investigated. The Hall of Records nevertheless survived because it satisfies several desires at once. It promises that human history has a missing master explanation. It suggests that catastrophe destroyed a superior civilization but failed to erase its knowledge completely. It places that knowledge beneath one of the world's most recognizable monuments. It also implies that modern institutions are either too cautious, too unimaginative, or too dishonest to reveal what independent seekers already suspect. The theory gives mystery a location, a villain, and a future moment of revelation. The Sphinx itself is unusually suited to this role. A pyramid is visibly architectural. Its chambers, passages, and internal structure belong to the logic of construction. The Sphinx is different because it is carved from bedrock. The boundary between monument and earth is less obvious. Its body appears to merge with the plateau. Anything beneath it seems both natural and potentially designed. The human face above the lion suggests intelligence guarding force, and the pose implies watchfulness. A guardian must be guarding something, the imagination insists, even though symbolic protection does not require a physical treasure beneath the paws. Later books, documentaries, websites, and television programs repeated the Hall of Records until it seemed older than it was. The modern origin faded, and the story was sometimes presented as an ancient Egyptian tradition. It was not. Egyptian texts speak extensively about sacred knowledge, divine books, temple archives, funerary writings, and guarded spaces. But no accepted ancient source identifies a Hall of Records beneath the Great Sphinx containing the legacy of Atlantis. The legend borrowed Egyptian atmosphere without inheriting Egyptian evidence. The association with Atlantis added another layer of distance. Plato's account of Atlantis was written more than 2,000 years after the probable construction of the Sphinx and belongs to a Greek philosophical context. Whether Plato intended the story as political allegory, moral warning, literary invention, or a narrative shaped by memories of real disasters remains debated. No archaeological chain connects Plato's island to the Giza Plateau. The Hall of Records combines two unresolved subjects and treats their union as explanation because Atlantis is lost and the Sphinx is mysterious. The lost records of Atlantis must lie beneath the Sphinx. A lesser-known feature of the myth is how often its predicted discovery date has shifted. When an expected opening fails to occur, the timeline moves. New technologies become the next promised key. Seismic surveys replace excavation. Radar replaces seismic work. Satellite imaging replaces radar. Each generation inherits the same chamber but equips the search with a newer instrument. The room remains just beyond confirmation, close enough to sustain belief but never clear enough to enter. This does not mean that everyone interested in the Hall of Records rejects archaeology. Some treat it as a cultural legend rather than a literal claim. Others use it as a way to express the broader truth that ancient knowledge has been lost. In that symbolic sense, the Sphinx does guard records, not a single archive, but information preserved in geology, construction, tool marks, restoration masonry, ancient inscriptions, and the arrangement of the surrounding landscape. These records are harder to read because they are fragmented and require patient interpretation. They do not offer one hidden book explaining human origins. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that real Egyptian archives were usually connected to institutions, temples, palaces, workshops, and administration. Texts appeared on papyrus, wood, pottery fragments, stone, and walls. Such materials require environmental conditions favourable to preservation. An underground chamber could preserve them, but a claim of that scale would need architectural evidence, an entrance, datable deposits, and independent confirmation. None has been demonstrated beneath the Sphinx. The Hall of Records therefore occupies a peculiar position. It has influenced real exploration without becoming real archaeology. It encouraged people to look more closely, but it also distorted how they interpreted what they found. The rear passage became disappointing because it was not the predicted corridor. Geological anomalies became exciting because they could be forced into the expected map. Conservation closures became suspicious because the myth required concealment. The most enduring lesson is that a modern legend can become part of an ancient monument's history even when the legend is false. Casey did not reveal a chamber beneath the Sphinx, but his prophecy changed why people searched, what they hoped to find, and how the public understood every later survey. The Hall of Records became a cultural structure built above the evidence, invisible but remarkably durable. As the legend spread, it also encouraged people to connect the Sphinx with every genuine underground feature across Giza. Tomb shafts, quarry cuts, pyramid passages, drainage channels, and natural cavities were gathered into one imagined system. The next task is therefore to widen the view beyond the lion itself and examine the plateau as a whole, where real tunnels are abundant, but rarely lead where the myth insists they should. Beyond the Sphinx enclosure, the Giza Plateau is genuinely full of underground spaces. Some are shallow cuts beneath ruined walls, others descend through vertical shafts into burial chambers carved deep in the limestone. Passages penetrate the pyramids, rock-cut tombs open along quarry faces. Trenches follow the edges of temples and causeways. Natural fissures run beneath areas later transformed by human hands. The landscape is not a solid platform supporting a few isolated monuments. It is a layered field of architecture, extraction, burial, repair, drainage, and geological weakness. That reality explains why claims of a connected tunnel system can sound plausible, even when the proposed connections have never been demonstrated. The most obvious subterranean structures are the pyramids themselves. The Great Pyramid contains descending and ascending passages, chambers at different levels, narrow shafts, and spaces detected only through modern imaging. Khafra's pyramid also contains corridors and chambers cut partly into the bedrock beneath the structure. Menka's pyramid includes its own sequence of descending routes and underground rooms. These were not accidental hollows. They were formal components of royal monuments, laid out with measurable alignments, constructed entrances, blocking systems, and recognizable architectural transitions. Their existence proves that Old Kingdom builders mastered excavation below ground. But it does not prove that every nearby monument was linked into one system. The pyramids were built as separate royal complexes with their own temples, causeways, subsidiary structures, cemeteries, and ritual routes. The underground passages within them served specific architectural and funerary purposes. No confirmed corridor runs from the Great Sphinx into Khafra's pyramid, despite the visual proximity of the two monuments. The bedrock between them includes quarry cuts, causeway foundations, geological layers, and later disturbances, but no mapped tunnel has been shown to bridge the distance. The imagined connection remains attractive because it would transform the Sphinx into a guardian of the pyramid's interior. Archaeologically, the two are connected through landscape planning, not through a demonstrated subterranean hallway. Cemeteries surrounding the pyramids add thousands of real underground features. Elite mastabas contain shafts dropping from rectangular superstructures into burial chambers below. Rock-cut tombs include corridors, offering rooms, niches, and hidden chambers. Later burials intruded into earlier structures. Some shafts were robbed in antiquity and reopened repeatedly. Others were sealed, forgotten, and rediscovered beneath sand. From above, a cemetery can appear almost empty. Beneath the surface, it may contain a dense grid of descending cuts. These tombs have generated stories of tunnels because robbers sometimes broke sideways between nearby chambers. A treasure hunter entering one shaft could follow weak stone or cut through a wall into another burial space. Later excavators might find irregular connections that were never part of the original plan. In a heavily reused necropolis, a network can emerge gradually from centuries of intrusion rather than from one ancient design. The distinction matters. Connected spaces do not necessarily imply a centralized underground complex. The area known as the Western Cemetery, west of the Great Pyramid, provides a modern example of how carefully anomalies must be interpreted. Geophysical surveys have detected subsurface features there, including a shallow structure with a roughly L-shaped form and a deeper irregularity beneath it. The location is archaeologically promising because the cemetery contains known tombs and apparently empty zones. Yet the researchers did not declare that instruments had found a palace, archive, or city. They described anomalies, proposed possible interpretations, and emphasized the need for excavation, even in a landscape where buried architecture is expected. Responsible investigation stops short of naming what has not been entered. This is the standard that must also be applied near the Sphinx. Giza's underground abundance raises the probability that additional features remain undiscovered, but it does not identify their form or function. A geophysical signal may belong to a tomb, a quarry trench, a natural fissure, a filled excavation, or a later structure. The plateau's archaeological richness increases both the possibility of discovery and the danger of misinterpretation. Quarries create another class of hidden and semi-hidden space. The pyramids required enormous quantities of stone, much of it extracted locally. Quarry faces, channels, block beds, ramps, and working floors altered the plateau on a scale that is easy to mistake for architecture. Once abandoned, quarry depressions filled with sand and debris. Later builders reused them. Settlements occupied sheltered zones. Tombs were cut into their edges. A deep quarry cut may resemble a defensive trench or ceremonial basin when its extraction history is forgotten. Near the Sphinx, the enclosure itself is the clearest example of quarrying transformed into sacred landscape. Farther across Giza, similar extraction-shaped routes, terraces, and hollows. Some passages described in older accounts as tunnels may be narrow quarry channels or spaces left between blocks. Others may be natural fissures exposed during stone removal. The plateau was not merely built upon, it was cut apart and reorganized. Drainage features add another layer. Rain at Giza is infrequent, but sudden storms can send water across hard surfaces and into low areas. Ancient builders shaped channels, gutters, slopes, and basins to manage runoff around monuments. Modern conservation work has added further drainage systems. A narrow channel disappearing beneath masonry can look like an entrance when seen without context. Yet its purpose may have been to carry water rather than people. The difference can be difficult to establish if later repairs altered the original surfaces. Some underground spaces belong to the ordinary functioning of the site. Storage pits, foundation trenches, construction cuts, post holes, and service areas survive beneath buildings and open ground. The settlements associated with workers and administrators included streets, galleries, workshops, bakeries, and storage facilities. Although most of these structures were not deeply subterranean, their buried remains form extensive archaeological layers. Giza's hidden world is therefore not limited to royal death. It includes food production, craft work, transport, accounting, and daily maintenance. That ordinary world is often overshadowed by the desire for a single extraordinary discovery. A buried bakery does not compete easily with a lost city. A drainage trench does not attract the attention given to a supposed corridor beneath the Sphinx. Yet these modest features explain how monumental construction was sustained. They show that the plateau's greatest secret was organizational rather than supernatural. Stone moved because crews quarried, hauled, recorded, fed, repaired, and coordinated it. The underground spaces of Giza also span long periods. Old kingdom tombs were reopened in later dynasties. New burials appeared beside ancient monuments. Religious buildings changed function. Roman visitors altered surfaces. Medieval quarrying removed stone. Modern excavators cut test trenches. Utilities and conservation systems entered the ground. A cavity discovered today may have several phases of use, none of them belonging to the original Pyramid Age. This chronological layering makes the idea of one unified underground city especially difficult to support. A genuine city would require repeated architectural patterns, connected circulation, construction phases, entrances, occupation deposits, ventilation, water management, and evidence of sustained use. Isolated anomalies and unrelated shafts do not meet that standard. No accepted excavation has documented such a complex beneath Giza. The latest non-destructive technologies continue to search the plateau. Muon imaging has shown remarkable potential inside pyramids because cosmic particles can reveal large density differences through massive stone. Radar and electrical surveys can identify buried contrasts nearer the surface. Seismic methods can trace weakened zones and possible voids. These technologies may discover spaces that traditional excavation missed, but they are most convincing when their results can be repeated and compared with known archaeology. The plateau therefore contains both a warning and a promise. Real underground discoveries remain possible. Giza has repeatedly revealed tombs, chambers, shafts, and structures where the surface seemed silent. But every genuine discovery has a location, material context, construction history, and measurable relationship to the surrounding landscape. The evidence grows stronger when methods agree and weaker when distant anomalies are combined into a single dramatic map. The Sphinx stands within this crowded subterranean world, but it is not automatically the center of it. its symbolic power draws unrelated features toward it in modern imagination. Tombs become tunnels leading to the guardian. Quarry cuts become chambers beneath it. Pyramid voids become parts of the same system. The map of Giza is redrawn according to desire. To separate the monument from that gravitational pull, researchers must return to the surfaces of the Sphinx enclosure itself. Those weathered walls have been used to argue not merely for hidden chambers, but for a hidden age, a time when heavier rains supposedly carved the stone long before the pharaohs claimed the plateau. The underground mystery is about to become a dispute over deep time. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure do more than surround the monument. They preserve the argument that has done more than almost any tunnel or anomaly to pull the guardian out of the Fourth Dynasty and into a far deeper past. Their surfaces are rounded, recessed, cut by vertical channels, and heavily weathered in ways that seem, at first glance, unlike the sharper wind-shaped forms expected in a desert. To some observers, these patterns suggest prolonged exposure to powerful rainfall. If that interpretation is correct, then the Sphinx may have stood beneath a wetter sky long before the Great Pyramid building age. The mystery would no longer concern only what lies beneath the monument. It would concern whether the accepted history above it is thousands of years too short. The modern form of this argument became widely known through the work of geologist Robert Schoch, who examined the enclosure and proposed that significant portions of the weathering were caused by rainfall and water runoff, rather than primarily by wind and sand. Because the Giza region was considerably wetter in earlier prehistoric periods, he suggested that the earliest carving of the Sphinx could predate the Fourth Dynasty by several thousand years. The implication was enormous. A monument usually placed around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE might instead belong to a society living near the end of the last ice age, or during the early Holocene, before the rise of dynastic Egypt as archaeology currently understands it. The claim did not emerge from an underground chamber, an inscription, or a datable artifact. It emerged from the shape of damaged stone. That makes the debate both fascinating and difficult, because weathering does not preserve a simple clock. Limestone changes according to its hardness, porosity, exposure, fracture pattern, salt content, moisture, burial history, and the direction from which water or wind arrives. Two adjacent beds can erode at sharply different rates. A vertical face may weather differently from a sloping one. A surface buried beneath sand for centuries may retain moisture, while an exposed surface dries and flakes. The same enclosure wall can record several processes acting at different times. Rainfall almost certainly played some role at Giza. The desert is not entirely rainless, and sudden storms can produce powerful runoff. Water crossing the plateau may collect in the enclosure, move down its walls, and exploit natural cracks. Even limited rainfall, repeated over long periods, can soften weak limestone and create vertical channels. The question is not whether water ever affected the Sphinx. It is whether the observed erosion requires exposure during a much wetter prehistoric climate, and therefore demands a construction date far earlier than the Old Kingdom. Supporters of the older date emphasize the rounded profiles and deep vertical weathering visible in portions of the enclosure. They argue that wind-driven sand tends to produce different forms, especially greater wear near ground level, while water flowing down exposed rock can create the recessed and rolling surfaces seen at the site. They also point to differences between the Sphinx enclosure and some nearby Old Kingdom tombs or quarry faces that appear less weathered. If structures of similar accepted age have different erosion patterns, they argue, the Sphinx may have been exposed for longer. Mainstream archaeological and geological responses focus on the complexity of the local stone and the history of the site. The Sphinx was carved into a low enclosure where moisture, salts, runoff, and accumulated sand interact differently than on open plateau surfaces. Its limestone beds vary greatly in durability. Some sections disintegrate rapidly, while others remain comparatively resistant. Nearby monuments are not always cut from precisely equivalent layers or exposed under the same conditions. Differences in appearance therefore do not necessarily represent differences of thousands of years in age. The enclosure may also have received water from the plateau above it. Runoff does not need a wetter Ice Age climate to become destructive if it is concentrated through a particular route. Quarrying and construction could have changed the natural flow of water, directing it towards certain walls. Later clearance exposed surfaces that had been buried. Repeated cycles of wetting and drying encouraged salt crystallization. Moisture trapped against the stone by sand may have weakened it from within. No single explanation fully accounts for every groove and recess, but a combination of ordinary processes acting over approximately 4.5 millennia can produce severe deterioration. Salt weathering is especially important because it can imitate forms often attributed to rainfall. Water enters porous limestone, carrying dissolved salts. As the surface dries, crystals grow inside small pores and cracks. Their expansion pushes mineral grains apart. The outer stone flakes away, exposing new material to the same process. Over time, a flat wall can become rounded and deeply recessed without requiring continuous streams of water. The process is often strongest near boundaries between rock layers and in areas where moisture repeatedly enters and evaporates. Burial beneath sand adds another complication. Sand can shield stone from direct wind abrasion, but it can also hold moisture against the surface. A partly buried enclosure may experience a humid microenvironment very different from the open desert above. The level of the sand rises and falls, causing different zones to weather under changing conditions. This history is difficult to reconstruct precisely because clearances occurred in antiquity, the Roman period, the 19th century, and modern times. Each excavation altered the monument's exposure. Seismic measurements entered the dating debate because slower wave speeds in the shallow bedrock were interpreted as zones of deeper weathering. Some researchers argued that the depth of this altered stone suggested a much longer period of exposure than the conventional chronology allowed. Yet converting a weathered depth into a date requires an assumed rate, and that rate may not remain constant. It varies with limestone quality, rainfall, groundwater, burial, salt action, and pre-existing fractures. A deeply weakened zone may follow a natural joint rather than record centuries of surface exposure. The instruments can measure contrast, but they cannot independently identify the year when the weathering began. The archaeological problem is equally severe for an extremely early sphinx. If a prehistoric society carved the original monument, evidence of that society should exist somewhere in the landscape. The task would have required planning, tools, labour, stone removal, and a cultural reason to create a colossal human-headed lion. Yet no accepted settlement, tool assemblage, inscription, sculpture tradition, or construction debris at Giza has been securely linked to such a project thousands of years before dynastic Egypt. The absence of evidence is not absolute proof that an earlier phase never existed, but the proposed date currently lacks the surrounding archaeological culture expected for an undertaking of this scale. Some versions of the theory attempt to solve that problem by proposing that the original monument was not the Sphinx seen today. Perhaps, they suggest, prehistoric builders carved a lion's head or another form that was later reshaped into the face of a pharaoh. The comparatively small head is sometimes offered as support, since its proportions appear modest against the immense body. Yet erosion, repeated recutting, restoration, and the constraints of the harder upper limestone may also explain the proportions. No surviving evidence clearly identifies an earlier head, and the idea remains speculative. The nearby temples present another obstacle. The stone removed from the enclosure appears closely related to the massive blocks used in the Sphinx Temple and Valley Temple. Their architecture fits the monumental traditions of the Old Kingdom, and the wider layout connects naturally with Khafra's complex. An earlier carving phase would therefore need to explain how prehistoric quarrying, later royal construction, and the present form of the monument fit together. Possible sequences can be imagined, but imagination is not the same as a demonstrated building history. The weathering debate is often presented as a conflict between courageous geology and defensive archaeology. But the real situation is less theatrical. Geologists themselves disagree about the processes and timescales involved. Archaeologists accept that rainfall and water contributed to erosion while disputing the need for a prehistoric construction date. Scholars debate how the enclosure drained, how quickly different beds deteriorated, and how burial altered the stone. The disagreement is genuine, but it does not divide neatly between those willing to examine evidence and those protecting an official story. What survives in the rock does suggest a complicated environmental history. The Sphinx has endured rainstorms, runoff, desert wind, sand burial, salt crystallization, groundwater movement, temperature change, and repeated exposure. Its walls record more than one process, and perhaps more than one climatic phase. Yet no weathering pattern currently provides a secure date, independent of archaeology. Stone can show that water passed across it. It cannot by itself name the people who carved it. This uncertainty makes the enclosure a perfect screen for deep time claims. To those who suspect a forgotten civilization, the rounded walls appear to be testimony that official chronology cannot silence. To those working within the Old Kingdom context, the same surfaces reveal vulnerable limestone altered through many interacting forces. Both begin with real erosion. They differ in how far they allow that erosion to carry the history. The most responsible conclusion remains narrower than either extreme. Water mattered. The monument may have experienced environmental conditions and drainage patterns not yet fully reconstructed. Some aspects of its deterioration remain debated, but the evidence does not currently require an Ice Age civilization, nor does it sever the Sphinx from the 4th Dynasty landscape around it. The deep past beneath the Guardian belongs first to geology, not to a confirmed lost culture. That distinction becomes even more important when investigation itself threatens the monument. Weathered limestone cannot tolerate unlimited drilling, excavation, or repeated entry. Every attempt to resolve one mystery may enlarge another crack or disturb an ancient surface. The age debate, the possible cavities, and the known passages all converge on the same practical problem: how far researchers can search beneath the Sphinx without damaging the evidence they're trying to understand. The strongest barrier between the Sphinx and complete certainty is not a locked door. It is the monument itself. The lion's body is not an untouched mass of perfect stone waiting to be explored. It is a weakened geological core covered in layers of ancient and modern repair, crossed by fractures, affected by salts, exposed to temperature changes, and burdened by the weight of its own survival. Every new hole drilled into that body risks creating another path for moisture. Every cavity opened may disturb unstable rock. Every excavation beneath the paws could alter the support of a monument that has already lost large portions of its original surface. This changes the meaning of caution. From a distance, refusal to excavate can look like secrecy. At the edge of a fragile limestone enclosure, it looks like responsibility. Archaeology is not simply the act of reaching hidden spaces. It is the controlled destruction of deposits in order to understand them. Once a layer is removed, it cannot be placed back in its original relationship. Once a sealed cavity is opened, its temperature, humidity, microbial environment, and structural balance may change permanently. A discovery can be damaged at the exact moment it becomes visible. The Sphinx presents an extreme version of this dilemma, because the suspected features lie beneath or within the monument rather than safely beside it. A trench opened in an empty field can be expanded if the walls remain stable. A trench opened beneath the chest of a colossal sculpture cannot be treated so casually. Removing supporting material may cause cracking above. Vibrations from drilling can travel through weakened beds. Heavy equipment is difficult to use inside the enclosure. Even a small intervention must account for the possibility that the stone has been hollowed by erosion behind the visible repair masonry. The paws are particularly sensitive because they combine carved bedrock, restoration blocks, later additions, and the dream stela between them. Any attempt to investigate an anomaly below this area must avoid damaging all of these phases. A narrow borehole might seem harmless, but its path could pass through masonry whose date is not fully understood. It might penetrate a fracture and redirect groundwater. It could introduce air into a cavity filled with loose sediment. A camera may reveal a dark space without showing whether the ceiling is stable enough for entry. The body itself is even more complicated. Much of what appears from outside to be a continuous lion surface is a protective facing built over eroded original limestone. Some repairs date to ancient Egypt. Others belong to modern campaigns. Behind them lie irregular gaps, weakened zones, and older masonry. To reach the original bedrock, investigators may need to remove blocks that are now performing a structural role. Even when those blocks are modern, taking them away can expose surfaces that have not faced open air for decades or centuries. Groundwater is another reason for restraint. The water table beneath Giza does not simply rise and fall like water in a clear basin. It moves through porous layers, fractures, sediment, and human-altered ground. Nearby irrigation, settlement, drainage, and construction can change local conditions. Moisture that does not directly flood the Sphinx can still carry salts into its limestone. Opening a cavity may change how that moisture evaporates, concentrating damage around the new entrance. Researchers therefore monitor more than visible water. They study humidity, electrical resistance, salt distribution, stone temperature, and the behavior of cracks. The hidden danger is often not a sudden collapse but slow deterioration. A fissure may widen by fractions of a millimeter. A repair block may separate from the core. Powdered stone may accumulate behind a facing. These changes are difficult to dramatize, yet they determine whether the monument remains stable enough to survive future investigation. Restricted access grows from these conditions. Only trained teams can safely work in the enclosure or enter known passages. Narrow cavities may contain loose debris, poor air circulation, insects, unstable ceilings, or sharp limestone edges. Visitors entering for curiosity can damage surfaces merely by touching them or disturbing sediment. Unauthorized exploration creates not only personal risk, but the loss of archaeological context. A footprint, moved stone, or cleared pile of debris may destroy evidence of when a passage was last entered. From the public side of the barrier, access restrictions can appear suspicious because people rarely see the conservation reasoning behind them. A hole is photographed during one campaign and later covered. A tunnel is entered by specialists but remains closed to tourists. Survey data are discussed in technical language rather than released as dramatic maps. These actions are easily interpreted as proof that authorities have found something important. Yet restricted access is normal at ancient sites. Most pyramid shafts, tomb chambers, unstable rooms, and conservation areas are not permanently open. Publication delays add to the problem. Mapping, processing, comparing, and interpreting geophysical data can take years. Teams may disagree internally about what an anomaly represents. Additional surveys may be required before a conclusion is published. Preliminary results sometimes leak into newspapers long before a technical study appears, creating a public version of the discovery that is more definite than the researcher's own understanding. When the final report is cautious, it can look like a retreat or suppression rather than the ordinary correction of early uncertainty. Ambiguous results are especially difficult to communicate. A survey may show a low-velocity zone beneath one part of the enclosure. Researchers cannot honestly call it a chamber, but saying only that the ground is anomalous seems unsatisfying. The public asks whether it is empty, artificial, ancient, or connected to another feature. The data may not answer any of those questions. The instrument has done its job by identifying contrast. The frustration comes from expecting the contrast to explain itself. Repeated surveys do not always solve the problem. Different technologies respond to different physical properties. Seismic waves may suggest fractured rock. Electrical methods may show moisture. Radar may detect a boundary at a slightly different depth. These results can be complementary, but they can also be difficult to align because the surveys use different grids, resolutions, and assumptions. One method may indicate a possible void where another sees only disturbed stone. That disagreement is not proof that one team is hiding the truth. It may reflect the complexity of the ground. Modern, non-destructive technologies offer the best hope of reducing risk, but they have limits. Muon imaging works especially well through large masses such as pyramids, where detectors can collect particles over long periods and identify major density differences. Applying similar methods around the low, irregular body of the Sphinx would involve different geometry and may not provide the same clarity. Radar loses effectiveness in certain wet or conductive conditions. Electrical surveys require good contact with the ground. Seismic work can be distorted by fractures and surface irregularities. No single device can produce a complete transparent model of the monument. The safest path is therefore incremental. Researchers map visible cracks, compare old photographs, monitor movement, repeat surveys, and investigate only where several lines of evidence agree. A small camera probe may be preferred to a large opening. A borehole may be considered only after structural engineers assess the risk. Excavation may proceed beside the monument rather than directly beneath it. These methods seem slow because they are slow. The Sphinx has survived for more than 4 millennia. There is little justification for damaging it to satisfy a question that can wait for better technology. A lesser-known difficulty is that conservation itself can erase clues if poorly documented. Earlier restorers sometimes filled cracks, replaced blocks, or sealed openings without leaving the detailed records expected today. Their work may have been necessary, but later researchers must distinguish original stone from ancient repair from modern repair, and conservation fill from archaeological blockage. An opening covered decades ago may now be structurally inaccessible even if its earlier appearance was photographed. Political and institutional pressures also shape exploration. Giza is a national heritage site, a major tourist destination, and a symbol recognized across the world. Any intervention carries public consequences. Authorities must balance research, preservation, tourism, safety, and national responsibility. Sensational claims can force hurried responses, while unverified announcements may damage trust. This environment encourages caution in language and procedure, although that caution is often misread as denial. What survives in the record suggests that exploration is limited not by one conspiracy, but by many overlapping realities: weak limestone, uncertain cavities, groundwater, old repairs, restricted access, imperfect instruments, incomplete documentation, and the irreversible nature of excavation. These limitations do not prove that nothing remains to be found. They explain why the unknown cannot simply be opened. The Sphinx continues to hold spaces that are poorly understood, but the monument is also evidence in its own right. Preserving it may require leaving some questions unanswered until safer methods exist. The challenge is not merely to discover what lies below. It is to ensure that the search does not destroy the guardian above. Only by accepting that limit can the known passages, geological cavities, survey anomalies, and modern claims be weighed honestly against one another. Once every limitation is acknowledged, the mystery beneath the Sphinx becomes clearer rather than smaller. The evidence can be arranged in layers, not according to how exciting each claim sounds, but according to how securely it is supported. At the firmest level are features that have been entered, mapped, photographed, or directly observed. Beyond them are cavities and irregular zones indicated by instruments. Farther still are interpretations that remain possible but unconfirmed. At the outer edge are stories that depend almost entirely on prophecy, media repetition, or disputed methods. The challenge is to keep those layers separate, because the moment they are blended together, a small fissure can become a chamber can become a network, and a network can become a buried civilization. The strongest evidence begins with the monument itself. The Sphinx was carved from the bedrock of the Giza Plateau, most likely during the 4th dynasty, and within the monumental landscape associated with Khafra. Its enclosure was created by quarrying away the surrounding limestone. The removed stone was connected to nearby temple construction. The body crosses different geological beds, some durable and others severely vulnerable to erosion. These facts are visible in the architecture, quarry relationships, mapped surfaces, and geology of the site. They establish the physical context in which every underground claim must be judged. It is also firmly established that the Sphinx is not perfectly solid in every direction. Natural fractures pass through the limestone. Some have widened through weathering. Some were modified by people. Small openings and cavities exist beneath repair masonry and within damaged zones of the body. Historical investigators cut or explored holes in search of hidden spaces. These features are real, but they do not form a single coherent system. Their origins vary, and many belong to natural geology, later intrusion, or restoration rather than to the original design. The rear passage is the clearest example. It penetrates the rump of the Sphinx and follows a natural fissure. Researchers have entered and documented it. The passage does not open into a larger constructed complex, and its rough form suggests that treasure seekers or later explorers enlarged an existing weakness. It is therefore reasonable to call it a real tunnel, but misleading to call it an Old Kingdom corridor. Its importance lies precisely in that distinction. It proves that people searched inside the monument, while providing no support for an ancient archive. The known vertical openings and probes belong to the same category. They demonstrate repeated attempts to test the Sphinx for internal hollows. Some reveal fracture-controlled spaces or limited cavities. Others appear to terminate within the bedrock. Several were later covered for protection. Their closure is not evidence that large discoveries were concealed. It is consistent with the need to stabilize damaged stone and prevent uncontrolled access. The evidence supports the existence of small entered features, not a hidden system extending beneath the plateau. The next layer consists of geophysical anomalies. Seismic surveys have recorded zones where waves travel differently from the surrounding limestone. Electromagnetic and electrical methods have detected contrasts that may relate to cavities, fractures, moisture, or altered rock. Some of these signals lie beside the Sphinx or near the front paws. They deserve attention because they indicate that the subsurface is not uniform. Yet no instrument has independently established that these zones are purpose-built rooms. The word cavity must remain broad. A cavity can be an open void, a sediment-filled crack, a dissolution pocket, a quarry irregularity, or a weakened layer with lower density than the surrounding stone. A geophysical map may suggest its approximate location, but it cannot automatically reveal its date or function. Until a signal is confirmed through several independent methods or direct observation, the most accurate description is an anomaly consistent with more than one explanation. This is where comparison with the Great Pyramid becomes useful. The large void detected above the Grand Gallery was recorded using multiple Mune technologies from different positions. Independent measurements confirmed a substantial density contrast. Even then, researchers avoided naming it a tomb or secret chamber. They described what the data actually supported: a large void of uncertain purpose. That disciplined language provides a standard for the Sphinx. No reported anomaly beneath the lion has yet received the same level of repeated independent confirmation. Groundwater surveys offer another body of reliable evidence, although it points away from treasure. Studies around Giza show that water, moisture, and salts are important to the preservation of the monuments. The average water table may not currently be flooding the Sphinx directly, but nearby urban and geological conditions create long-term risks. Electrical, radar, and seismic methods can detect these wet or altered zones, which means that some underground signals may reflect hydrology rather than architecture. The secret beneath the Sphinx may be a conservation problem before it is an archaeological one. The evidence also supports a dense underground landscape across Giza. Tomb shafts, burial chambers, pyramid passages, quarries, trenches, drainage features, and later cuts are well documented. More buried features almost certainly remain. Recent surveys elsewhere on the plateau have detected promising anomalies that require excavation. None of this is surprising in a necropolis used and reused for thousands of years. What is unsupported is the assumption that these separate spaces connect into one coordinated underground city centered on the Sphinx. The Hall of Records falls outside the archaeological evidence altogether. Its modern form originates with Edgar Cayce and the belief that Atlantean knowledge was hidden beneath the monument. No ancient Egyptian text describes such a chamber. No mapped passage reaches it. No excavated deposit contains material connected to it. The legend influenced exploration, but influence is not confirmation. It belongs to the history of modern imagination rather than to the architecture of Giza. The same caution applies to recent claims of vast underground structures detected through satellite radar or unconventional signal processing. In 2025, dramatic reports described columns, shafts, and a buried city beneath the Khafra area. In 2026, related media stories added the possibility of a second Sphinx or another enormous structure underground. These claims attracted attention because they arrived with technical imagery and the language of remote sensing. Yet they were not supported by accepted archaeological excavation, independently replicated scans, or broadly validated peer-reviewed analysis. The disputed method behind some of these claims attempts to infer internal or subsurface structures from radar data in ways that many specialists consider physically implausible at the proposed depths and resolution. Ordinary satellite radar cannot simply see kilometers through solid limestone. Supporters argue that indirect effects or micro-movements allow deeper reconstruction, but the technique remains controversial. Computer-generated images can appear highly detailed, yet detail in a model is not necessarily detail in the ground. Until independent teams reproduce the findings with established methods, the supposed city remains a claim rather than a discovery. The strongest criticism is not that extraordinary structures are impossible in principle. Archaeology has repeatedly uncovered unexpected architecture. The criticism is that extraordinary interpretation requires evidence proportionate to its scale. A vast underground city should produce consistent geophysical results: entrances, ventilation routes, displaced stone, construction debris, surface relationships, and eventually datable archaeological material. None of these has been demonstrated. What survives in the public record is an assertion far larger than the verified data beneath it. This leaves a middle ground that should not be ignored. Small unmapped cavities may exist. Some seismic anomalies may eventually prove artificial. A blocked cut could preserve evidence of an old exploratory passage. Future technologies may reveal spaces too dangerous to reach today. The absence of a confirmed Hall of Records does not mean the subsurface is perfectly understood. It means that the present evidence supports limited, local, and ambiguous features rather than a monumental hidden world. No single explanation fully accounts for every crack, cavity, and irregular signal around the Sphinx. Geology explains much. Quarrying explains more. Treasure hunting, restoration, drainage, and centuries of disturbance add further complexity. Some questions remain open because the monument cannot be excavated freely. Others remain open because old investigations were poorly recorded. Uncertainty is therefore genuine, but it must not be confused with positive evidence for the most dramatic theory available. The honest conclusion is both restrained and intriguing. There are real passages, but they are small. There are real anomalies, but their causes are uncertain. There are real underground structures at Giza, but none has been shown to form a city beneath the Sphinx. There are modern claims of immense hidden architecture, but they remain unverified. The strongest secret is not a chamber waiting to be opened. It is the widening distance between what the evidence can support and what people continue to imagine. That distance has become part of the monument's legacy. The Sphinx guards no confirmed lost library, yet it continues to produce stories because its body merges with the earth, its earliest records are incomplete, and its fractures disappear into darkness. Even after a century of excavation, the Guardian retains enough uncertainty to resist a final explanation. The last question is not whether every mystery has been solved, but why the Sphinx remains so powerful even when the grandest claims fall away. The Sphinx remains powerful because the collapse of one legend does not empty the monument of mystery. Remove the Hall of Records, and the fractured limestone remains. Reject the buried city, and the geophysical anomalies still require interpretation. Dismiss the idea of a prehistoric super-civilization, and the original name, exact commission, and full ritual meaning of the guardian are still incomplete. Archaeology has reduced the number of possible answers, but it has not transformed the Sphinx into something ordinary. The monument continues to stand at the boundary between what can be measured and what can only be reconstructed. This is partly because the Sphinx does not preserve its history in a single form. A temple can be studied through its walls, inscriptions, floors, and objects. A tomb may retain a burial plan, human remains, offerings, and blocking stones. The Sphinx is sculpture, quarry, geological exposure, sacred image, restoration project, and archaeological site at the same time. Its body is both artifact and landscape. A crack can belong to the formation of the limestone, the carving of the monument, later erosion, an intrusive search, or several of these stages together. The evidence is not merely incomplete. It is layered in ways that resist separation. The earliest builders left the greatest silence. Their tools shaped the lion, but their explanation has not survived. They did not leave a clear inscription naming the monument, describing its symbolism, or listing every feature in the surrounding complex. That silence gave later Egyptians room to reinterpret the guardian as Hora-Maket, Horus in the horizon. It gave Greek and Roman visitors an object of wonder. It gave medieval observers an immense head rising from sand. It gave 19th century explorers a buried monument to uncover. It gave 20th century mystics a place to hide Atlantis. Each age encountered the same stone but built a different sphinx around it. Modern archaeology has stripped away some of those later constructions without returning completely to the first one. Mapping reveals the body's relationship to the quarry and temples. Geological study explains why fissures and cavities occur. Excavation reconstructs phases of burial and restoration. Conservation records show how much of the present surface is supported by masonry, added long after the original carving. These methods recover fragments of biography, but the first moment remains just beyond direct reach. No excavation can return to the morning when the final stone was cut away, and the guardian first faced the eastern horizon. That lost moment encourages the idea that the answer must still exist somewhere underground. Modern culture often treats missing information as hidden information. If a record is absent, perhaps it was sealed in a chamber. If no entrance is visible, perhaps it was deliberately blocked. If instruments detect an irregularity, perhaps they have found what the text failed to preserve. Yet history is not always concealed intact. More often, it is damaged, scattered, reused, weathered, and forgotten. The missing records of the Sphinx may not be waiting in any room, they may simply be gone. This is the quieter truth behind many ancient mysteries. The past rarely preserves itself according to modern curiosity. It does not save the document that would settle the debate. It leaves broken inscriptions, reused blocks, eroded surfaces, disturbed deposits, and later stories that are easier to hear than the original silence. The Sphinx seems to promise completeness because it looks permanent. Its gaze appears unchanged. Its immense body suggests endurance. But the monument has lost its nose, beard, pigments, much of its original surface, and perhaps the very language through which its makers understood it. Even its familiar appearance is deceptive. The exposed lion is maintained through constant human effort. Sand is controlled, cracks are monitored, weak stone is supported, groundwater is studied, restoration blocks are repaired. Visitors see an ancient monument, but also the result of modern preservation decisions. Without that work, burial and deterioration would continue. The Sphinx is not simply surviving time, It is being helped through it. This dependence gives the underground mystery a strange reversal. For centuries, people have imagined the guardian protecting what lies beneath. In reality, the greater concern may be protecting the guardian from what lies beneath, and within it unstable layers, moisture, salt, voids, and fractures. The stone below is not merely a container for possible discoveries. It is the foundation upon which the monument depends. Opening every cavity would not necessarily reveal the past. It might endanger what remains of it. Future technology may change the balance. Improved muon detectors, higher resolution seismic arrays, better radar processing, environmental monitoring, and less invasive probes may reveal spaces that current methods cannot distinguish. A small chamber could be confirmed. A natural fissure might prove to have been modified in antiquity. An anomaly near the paws may eventually receive a clear geological explanation. Discovery remains possible, but its likely form may be more modest than the mythology surrounding it. The next important finding could be a drainage cut, an ancient repair cavity, a quarry feature, or evidence of how workers stabilized a weakness in the bedrock. Such discoveries would not be failures. They would bring the monument closer to the people who made and maintained it. A construction cut could reveal planning. Tool marks could identify a sequence of work. Sediment inside a fissure might show when the passage was opened. A repair pocket could preserve evidence of an ancient conservation campaign. Archaeology advances through details that rarely resemble the final scene of an adventure story. The newest claims will almost certainly continue. Satellite images will be processed into suggestive shapes. Old photographs will be rediscovered without their captions. Covered openings will be presented as sealed doors. Technical terms will migrate into headlines stripped of uncertainty. Some claims will disappear. Others will become permanent parts of the Sphinx's modern mythology. The monument has outlived every interpretation placed upon it, and it will likely outlive these as well. What survives in the record suggests that the Sphinx does not need a hidden city to remain extraordinary. Its verified history already reaches across the rise and decline of kingdoms, religious transformations, foreign empires, repeated burial, excavation, damage, and restoration. It was ancient when Thutmose IV cleared the sand from its paws. It was already mysterious when Greek visitors tried to understand it. It had lost much of its earliest identity before modern archaeology existed. The evidence beneath it is smaller than the legend, but no less compelling. A real passage follows a fracture through the rump. Small cavities and probes mark repeated attempts to enter the stone. Seismic and electrical surveys reveal contrasts whose causes remain uncertain. Water and salt move invisibly through the limestone. The enclosure walls preserve a disputed environmental history. These are not pieces of one hidden machine. They are traces of a monument interacting with geology and human curiosity over thousands of years. The unanswered questions should remain open without being filled prematurely. Some spaces may still be unexplored. Some anomalies may eventually prove artificial. The exact sequence of carving and temple construction may be refined. The face may continue to invite competing identifications. Scholars may improve their understanding of drainage, weathering, and restoration. But no responsible conclusion currently supports a hall of records, an underground metropolis, or a second buried sphinx beneath Giza. The final image is therefore not a sealed door waiting for permission to open. It is the monument at dusk, when the enclosure begins to darken and the divisions between carved body and natural plateau become harder to see. The lion seems to settle back into the limestone from which it emerged. Cracks vanish into shadow. The paws frame a stela left by a king, who lived closer to the builders than the present age does, yet still regarded the Guardian as an inheritance from deep antiquity. Beneath that fading outline lies no confirmed lost world, only stone crossed by time, water, human tools, and unfinished questions. The Sphinx keeps its mystery, not because someone has successfully hidden the truth, but because the past rarely survives whole. What remains is enough to measure, enough to challenge, and enough to remind every generation that the distance between knowledge and imagination can be as enduring as the monument itself. Night settles slowly over Giza. The sharp heat withdraws from the limestone. The distant city becomes a glow beyond the plateau, and the Sphinx returns to the stillness that has defined most of its existence. By daylight, every fracture invites measurement. Every blocked opening suggests a question. Every shadow along the paws seems to promise a passage descending into the earth. But in the fading light, the monument becomes less like a puzzle waiting to be solved and more like a fragment of time that has survived without any obligation to explain itself. Perhaps that is why the search beneath the Sphinx never truly ends. Human beings are uncomfortable with incomplete stories. They prefer a sealed chamber to a missing record, a deliberate secret to a forgotten name, and a hidden library to the possibility that knowledge can simply disappear. The Hall of Records offers reassurance in disguise. It suggests that the past remains intact somewhere, protected from fire, erosion, conquest, and neglect, waiting for the right generation to recover it. Yet the real past is more fragile. Papyrus decays, paint fades, faces are broken, names fall from memory, sand fills sacred spaces, and later hands rebuild monuments according to needs their creators could never have imagined. Even stone, which seems permanent, softens under water, salts, wind, and time. The Great Sphinx has survived not because it escaped these forces, but because it endured them imperfectly. Its true archive may be scattered across the monument itself, a tool mark beneath a repair block, a natural fissure widened by an unknown seeker, a weathered wall shaped by ancient rain, a temple block cut from the enclosure, or a narrow passage ending quietly inside the rock. None provides the single revelation promised by legend. Together, they preserve something more human, a history of building, worship, abandonment, curiosity, damage, and care. Future researchers may discover another cavity. Better instruments may resolve an old anomaly. A forgotten photograph or excavation note may explain an opening that now appears mysterious. But even the most important discovery will become another layer in the Sphinx's long story, not the final word upon it. For now, the Guardian remains where its makers left it, facing the horizon while the desert darkens around its body. Beneath it lies limestone, moisture, fractures, perhaps small spaces still unseen, and the accumulated weight of everything people have hoped to find there. Above it, the stars return over Giza, as they have for thousands of years, and between the stone below and the sky above, the Sphinx keeps watch not over a confirmed lost city, but over the far more delicate mystery of how much of the human past can vanish, and how little is needed for memory to begin again.